I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A chance to get away from the city and spend some time camping alone in the woods. The place I chose was a small state park I'd never visited before, known for its dense forest and quiet trails. I packed my backpack carefully the night before, making sure I had all the basics. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a first aid kit. I also packed a map of the area and a compass. Even though my phone had GPS, I didn't want to rely on technology too much out here. The drive took longer than I expected. The park was tucked away off a narrow dirt road that quickly disappeared into thick trees. When I finally pulled into the small parking lot, only one other car was there. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. I grabbed my gear and headed into the forest, eager to find a good spot to set up camp. The trail was uneven and covered in roots and fallen leaves, but it wasn't hard to follow. I kept my eyes on the map, stopping a few times to check my location. I wanted to camp near the river shown on the map, thinking it would be nice to have the sound of flowing water nearby. After about an hour's walk, I reached a small clearing beside a narrow riverbank. The spot looked perfect. Flat ground, some large rocks for sitting, and a few dry patches under the trees for pitching the tent. I set up my tent slowly, making sure the stakes were secure in the ground. The fabric rustled as I pulled it taut, the smell of fresh canvas mixing with the pine needles beneath my feet. The air smelled clean and earthy. I noticed a few small animal tracks near the river, probably deer or raccoons. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew quieter except for the gentle murmur of the river and the occasional bird call. I started a small fire in the fire pit, using dry twigs and leaves I had gathered nearby. Flames flickered and popped, sending little sparks up into the darkening sky. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice over the fire, eating slowly while watching the shadows grow longer. The temperature was dropping quickly, and I zipped my jacket tightly around me. After dinner, I cleaned my cooking area, making sure to pack away any food scraps so I wouldn't attract animals. The night settled in, deep and dark. The trees loomed tall above me, their branches scratching softly against one another in the light breeze. I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed, the thin fabric blocking most of the night sounds. My flashlight sat on the ground beside me, ready in case I needed it. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the river and feeling the gentle night wind press against the tent walls. For a while, I felt completely calm and at peace. But as the hours passed, the calmness began to fade. I started hearing noises outside, subtle sounds at first, like twigs snapping and leaves rustling. At first, I thought it was just animals moving through the forest, maybe a raccoon or an owl. But then the sounds grew closer, more deliberate. Something heavy was moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. My heart rate sped up. I stayed as still as I could, trying not to make a sound. I reached slowly for my flashlight, the beam slicing through the tent's thin fabric as I turned it on. Outside, the trees stood silent. The rustling stopped. I held my breath, watching the narrow circle of light for any movement. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some small animal passing by. But deep down, I felt uneasy. The forest suddenly seemed much larger and more enclosed at night, the shadows deeper and harder to read. I decided to stay awake for a while longer, listening carefully to the sounds around me. The river's murmur was steady, but I kept hearing soft noises coming from the forest's edge, the occasional crunch of a branch, the faint scraping of bark. At one point, I thought I heard something heavy breathing just outside the clearing. I grabbed my small hunting knife from the tent floor, holding it tightly in my hand. The knife was sharp and had a sturdy grip. It was more for my own peace of mind than for any real defense. I told myself again it was just animals, that people didn't just wander these woods at night. Still, I didn't want to take any chances. After what felt like hours, the noises finally stopped. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke suddenly just before dawn, the first pale light filtering through the trees. My body was stiff and my mind alert. I sat up and unzipped the tent. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, birds chirping and dew glittering on the grass. I stepped outside and looked around the clearing carefully. What I saw made my stomach drop. Near the edge of the clearing, just beyond where I had set up camp, were several deep footprints in the soft earth. They were large, much larger than mine. The prints were fresh, still damp from the night's rain. They circled the clearing, moving in and out of the trees, but none of them came closer to the tent. It was clear whatever had been here had been watching me. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. Whoever or whatever had made those prints had come very close during the night and had stayed nearby. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave the area. As I folded my tent and strapped my pack, I scanned the forest carefully. The sun was rising now, lighting the trees and the river in soft gold. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I took the trail back toward the parking lot. The walk was tense. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes. About halfway back, I heard a distant shout. It was muffled, but it was definitely a human voice. Not far from the trail, but hidden behind thick trees. My heart jumped, and I quickened my pace. The voice didn't call again. It was as if whoever had shouted was alone or lost. I kept walking until the trail opened to the dirt road. When I reached my car, relief flooded me. The engine started right away, and I drove slowly out of the park. On the way home, I thought about what had happened. The prints, the noises, the voice. It all made sense in one way. There had been another person in the woods at night, someone who was probably camping or maybe even living out here. They had come near my camp but didn't want to be seen or caught. I realized that the forest could be a dangerous place not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of people. People who might be unpredictable, lost, or even hostile. When I got back to my apartment, I unpacked my gear and cleaned everything carefully. I called the park ranger the next day to report what I had seen. The prints, the noises, and the voice. They thanked me and said they would check the area, reminding me to always let someone know where I was going when camping. Looking back, I felt glad I had trusted my instincts and stayed alert. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild and full of things you can't always control. Being careful and prepared made all the difference. That trip taught me something important. Nature doesn't have to be scary in a supernatural way to be dangerous. It's real, and so are the risks. Since then, I've been camping a few more times, but never alone, and always with extra caution. The forest stays wild, but so do the people who visit it. And sometimes, that can be the scariest thing of all. It was late June when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been working long hours at a small construction company in Indiana, and I needed a break. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a quiet spot with trees, fresh air, and no one around. I picked a place I'd never been to before, somewhere in southern Missouri, near the edge of the Mark Twain National Forest. I'd seen it on a hiking forum online. Someone had mentioned an old logging road that led deep into the woods, far enough away that you wouldn't hear or see a soul. I took Friday off and left early that morning. The drive was long and boring. Flat roads, patches of farmland, the occasional gas station. By the time I got near the forest, it was close to noon. The sun was out, but not too hot. I stopped in a small town called Salem to top off the tank, grab a sandwich, and check the tires. Then I followed the directions I had saved on my phone until I found the logging road. It was just a dirt path barely wide enough for my pickup. No signs, no gates, just trees on both sides and deep tire ruts that looked like no one had driven down it in months. I drove slow, careful not to bottom out. Branches scraped along the sides of the truck, and the road twisted more than I expected. I had to reverse a few times to keep from getting stuck. After about 40 minutes, I found a spot where the trees opened up into a flat clearing, maybe 50 feet across. It was quiet, too quiet, in a way that made me pause for a second. But I told myself that was the point. No people, no sounds of the highway, just birds and bugs and wind in the trees. I parked near a fallen log and got out. The air was thick with pine and old leaves. There were no signs anyone had camped there before. No fire rings, no trash, no footprints. That was a good thing, I figured. I took out my gear, set up the small green tent I always used, and laid out my sleeping pad and bag inside. I cracked open a beer, leaned against a tree, and just sat for a while, enjoying the stillness. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood, walking a little around the area, and setting up a basic camp. I always carried extra water and food, canned soup, granola bars, and a cooler with sandwiches and ice. I brought my small hatchet, a lighter, a flashlight, and a big fixed-blade knife I usually kept strapped to my leg. There was no cell signal out there, which I expected, so I turned off my phone to save battery. Around dusk, I built a fire and cooked a simple dinner. The woods grew darker and heavier with each minute. I watched the sun fade behind the treetops and the shadows stretch across the clearing. The bugs came out, and I kept close to the fire to avoid getting eaten alive. I didn't hear anything strange that first night, just owls and crickets and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Around 10, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The forest at night was a different world. I could hear every twig snap, every leaf that shifted. I lay still in my sleeping bag for a long time, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. There was no moon, and it was pitch black outside. I had the hatchet next to me and the flashlight in hand, just in case. Eventually, I must have drifted off. The next morning started fine. I woke up with the sun, stretched, and stepped outside. Everything was still and calm. I boiled some water for coffee and ate a protein bar. Then I decided to hike a little. I didn't bring a map since I wasn't planning to go far, just wander around a bit. I made sure to note landmarks, an oddly shaped rock, a twisted tree stump, just to keep my bearings. I walked maybe a mile into the woods, circling back toward camp in a wide loop. The trees were tall and thick, and the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to swallow the light. But I never felt lost. I got back to camp around 11 and noticed something off right away. A stick had been moved. It wasn't big, but I'd laid it across the fire pit the night before after the flames died down. Now it was lying a few feet away, broken in half. I stood there staring at it, trying to remember if I had done that myself without realizing. Maybe I kicked it by accident. I checked the tent. Nothing missing. Cooler still closed. Hatchet and knife where I left them. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Raccoons maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept scanning the trees around the clearing, half expecting someone to step out. No one did. Still, I kept the knife on me from then on. That afternoon, I stayed close to camp. I read a little from the book I brought, whittled at a stick, and kept the fire going. I didn't want to hike anymore. Around 3, I heard what sounded like a cough in the distance. Not an animal sound. It was too short, too human. It came from deep in the woods behind the tent. I froze, waited. Nothing. I walked a few steps toward the tree line, peering into the woods. No movement, no sounds. I held the hatchet tighter and backed away. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the fire burning longer than usual, throwing on logs every hour just to have some light. I thought about getting in the truck and leaving, but it was already dark and the road was narrow and rough. If I drove it at night, I risked getting stuck or hitting a tree. I told myself I'd leave at first light. I zipped up the tent and lay inside, staring at the mesh ceiling, listening to every noise. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, crunching leaves, a few at a time, then stopping, then starting again. I couldn't see anything, but I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals are lighter, quicker. This was heavy, deliberate. I didn't breathe, just listened. It circled the tent. I could hear it stepping near the fire pit, close to the log I'd sat on earlier. Then it stopped, dead silent. I gripped the knife, ready to lunge if something pulled the tent open. But it didn't. I don't know how long I lay like that, but I didn't sleep a minute. When the sky finally started to lighten, I threw everything into the truck. Tent, sleeping bag, food, all of it. I didn't even fold anything, just shoved it into the bed and slammed the tailgate shut. Then I jumped in and started driving out. The road was harder to follow in reverse. The ruts had filled with water overnight, and I slid a few times, almost hitting a tree on one turn. My hands were sweating, gripping the wheel too tight. I looked in the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see someone step out of the woods. But I never did. After what felt like hours, I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I reached a diner back near Salem. I parked, walked inside, and sat at a booth near the window. I was dirty, tired, and probably looked half crazed. I ordered coffee and eggs and sat there for a long time, just staring out at the parking lot. I kept thinking about those footsteps, the broken stick, the cough in the trees. I told myself it was probably a hunter, maybe someone camping illegally, maybe just some guy out there for the same reason I was. But something about the way he moved, the silence, the slow circling, none of it felt casual. It felt planned, intentional. I never went back to that forest. In fact, I haven't camped alone since then. These days, if I go out, it's with friends, always in state-run campgrounds, always within walking distance of other people. I still think about what might have happened if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't left early, if I'd gone just a little deeper into those woods. I'll never know who was out there with me that night or what they wanted. But I do know one thing for sure, I wasn't alone. And that's what still keeps me up some nights, even years later. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. The work had been stressful, and the city noise had worn me down. I wanted nothing more than to get out into the wilderness, away from people and technology, to clear my head and just breathe fresh air. I didn't want crowds or organized campgrounds. Instead, I picked a remote spot deep in a forest I'd heard about through some online hiking forums, a place known to few with no official trails leading directly to it. The idea of being truly alone in nature, surrounded only by trees and silence, felt like the perfect antidote. I packed light but carefully. A sturdy backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, a good knife, a headlamp, matches, a first aid kit, and a map of the area. I was prepared to be self-sufficient. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, only that I was heading out for a few days of solo camping. It wasn't unusual for me, but this time I felt especially eager to disconnect. No phone, no internet, just me and the wild. The day I left was clear and cool. The sun was shining, but the air had a crispness to it that told me fall was coming soon. I drove a couple of hours to the trailhead, parked my car at a small dirt lot, double-checked my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trail was faint but visible, passing through tall pines and hardwoods. I loved the smell of pine needles underfoot and the sound of dry leaves crunching as I walked. Occasionally, a squirrel or a bird would dart through the underbrush, but otherwise it was peaceful. After a while, the trail disappeared almost completely. I had to rely on my map and compass, which I was comfortable using. I navigated by the sun and landmarks. An old fallen tree, a small creek, a rocky ridge. The terrain was hilly and rugged, but I enjoyed the challenge. By late afternoon, I found the clearing I had been aiming for. It was a small flat area surrounded by thick forest on all sides. Perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure it was sheltered from the wind by a thick cluster of bushes. I gathered some dry wood and started a fire. The scent of burning wood mixed with the earth and leaves was comforting. I boiled water for dinner, freeze-dried pasta with some dried vegetables, and ate slowly, watching the sunlight fade through the trees. The forest turned dark quickly once the sun went down, and the shadows deepened into an almost black velvet. I cleaned up and put out the fire as best I could, knowing that leaving a campfire unattended was dangerous. I settled into my sleeping bag, the tent walls thin but sturdy. I could hear the normal sounds of the forest at night, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crack of a branch. It was peaceful and a little wild, exactly what I had wanted. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. Something felt off. My body was tense and my eyes wide open in the dark tent. I listened carefully. There was a faint noise outside, something slow and deliberate. It was not the typical sounds of animals or wind. It was heavier, like footsteps. I stayed still, heart beating fast but trying not to panic. The noise came from the edge of the clearing. Something was moving quietly among the trees, just out of the range of my weak flashlight. I didn't want to leave the safety of the tent, but I also knew I couldn't ignore it. The forest was supposed to be empty, at least of other people. Minutes passed. The footsteps stopped. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was an animal, I heard a faint snap, a branch breaking underfoot. Much too loud to be a squirrel or deer. My mind raced through possibilities. Could someone be nearby? Someone who wasn't supposed to be there? I remembered the stories I'd heard about people getting lost, or worse, encountering trouble in isolated forests. I grabbed my knife, feeling its cold metal handle, and unzipped the tent a crack. The cool night air rushed in. I peeked out. The fire pit was dark and cold. No sign of fire or light, which meant whoever had been there hadn't started a fire. The trees stood motionless except for the wind gently shaking their tops. No one in sight. I zipped the tent back up, trying to calm down. Maybe it was a deer or a bear. But then, I remembered how bears usually made noise when they walked, crunching branches, sniffing loudly. This felt different, more deliberate, like a person. I decided to keep my headlamp within reach and sat quietly, straining my ears for any sound. The night went on, and eventually, the footsteps didn't return. I tried to sleep, but only managed a few restless hours before dawn. When the first light filtered through the trees, I crawled out of the tent to survey the area. The forest looked untouched. The ground near the fire pit was cold, but there were no footprints except mine. No signs of recent visitors. That night's noises could have been my imagination, or some animal that had moved more quietly than usual. I told myself to relax. Maybe I was just scared being alone in the dark. I ate breakfast slowly, savoring the quiet morning. The sun warmed the air, and the forest felt friendly again. I packed up my things and decided to explore a bit before heading back. I followed the creek upstream, admiring the way the water sparkled over the rocks. The trees here were older and taller, their trunks thick and knotted. Fallen leaves made a soft carpet on the forest floor. I spotted some deer tracks near the water, fresh and clear. I knelt down to examine them. The animals hadn't been far away. It reminded me how alive the forest was, even without people. The creek led to a small waterfall that poured into a shallow pool. The sight and sound of the rushing water were soothing. I took a deep breath and filled my water bottle from the creek, trusting my filter to clean it. Suddenly, something caught my eye. Half buried under some leaves and dirt, a small, weathered backpack. It was partially hidden under a bush, dirty but intact. I hadn't seen it before. I moved closer and checked it carefully. It looked old, faded, and worn. I opened it slowly and found some empty water bottles, a crumpled map, and a few torn pieces of clothing. No identification. My heart skipped. This wasn't my gear. Someone else had been here recently, or maybe not so recently. But where were they now? I felt a chill run down my spine. I stuffed the items back, leaving everything as I found it. I took note of the location, thinking about what to do next. I debated whether to keep going or return to my car and report it. But there was no cell signal here, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I decided to move carefully and be more alert. The rest of the day passed without incident. I didn't find any more signs of human presence, but I felt watched. The forest, so welcoming at dawn, now seemed full of shadows and unseen eyes. I stayed close to my camp when I returned, keeping my knife ready and the headlamp nearby. The next night was colder. The wind picked up, rattling the tent fabric and shaking the trees. Couldn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer. Someone was definitely out there. The sounds were slow, deliberate, careful, like they were trying not to make noise but failing a little. I lay perfectly still, breath shallow, listening as the footsteps circled my camp. I tried to tell myself it was probably a lost hiker or someone else camping nearby, but something about the way the steps moved felt calculated, cautious, not aimless. Suddenly, I noticed a small beam of light flickering through the trees. A flashlight. Someone was walking around with a flashlight. I grabbed my knife and unzipped the tent a bit. I shone my headlamp out, hoping to scare them off or at least let them know I was awake and aware. The light stopped moving for a moment, then quickly retreated deeper into the woods. I didn't hear footsteps running, but they disappeared. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any sounds. The forest was silent after that. The next morning, I debated whether to leave right away or wait for a bit. The idea of hiking back through those woods with someone else out there made me nervous. But I also didn't want to stay any longer. I packed up quickly, keeping my knife ready. On the way back to the car, I kept my eyes open for any sign of the other person. The forest felt thick and impenetrable, every shadow potentially hiding someone. I stuck to the most open paths and avoided thick brush. About halfway back, I found a small clearing with something strange on the ground. A tarp, roughly folded, and some broken camping gear. It looked like whoever had been there left in a hurry or something happened. I didn't touch anything but took a mental picture of the spot. I started walking faster, heart pounding, ready for anything. The trail became clearer and easier. Soon, I heard the distant hum of cars. Relief washed over me. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a few minutes, catching my breath. I called the local ranger station from my cell and reported what I'd seen. The abandoned gear, the footprints, the strange noises. They told me they would send someone to check the area. I had been working long hours for months, barely taking time off, and I was burning out. I needed a break, something real, quiet, away from screens and traffic and noise. In late September of 2019, I finally gave in and planned a short solo camping trip in northern Washington. The weather was starting to cool, the trees were just beginning to turn, and I thought it would be perfect to spend a few days alone in the woods, clearing my head. I chose a spot I'd found online through a backcountry hiking forum, a small, unofficial clearing next to a lake that wasn't marked on the park's main maps. It was deep in the national forest, off a long gravel road that branched from a barely maintained trailhead. The people who had posted about it said it was peaceful, remote, and not well known. That was exactly what I was looking for. I packed carefully. A good sleeping bag, extra layers, a tarp in case it rained, freeze-dried meals, my old backpacking stove, a water filter, and a small solar charger. I brought a flashlight, 2 headlamps, a hunting knife I'd never used outside the kitchen, and bear spray. I double-checked everything. I let my brother know exactly where I was going and when I'd be back, and I told him I'd text him by the evening of the 3rd day. I even left a note taped inside my apartment door, just in case. The drive out took about 4 hours. The last hour was all gravel, full of potholes and overgrown brush smacking the sides of my car. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches. The trailhead was nothing more than a dirt lot with space for 2 vehicles and an old wooden sign that looked like it hadn't been cleaned or maintained in years. My car was the only one there. The hike in was longer than I expected. The trail was barely marked, with lots of sections overgrown with tall grass and saplings, but the directions I'd copied from the forum were clear, and I made it to the lake after a little over 2 hours of walking. The clearing was beautiful, quiet, maybe 20 feet across, tucked between thick evergreens, with just enough flat ground for a tent and a fire ring made from old blackened stones. The lake itself was glassy and still, with no dock or trail around it, just trees. I didn't see any animals, and I didn't hear anything except for the wind and the occasional bird. Felt good to be there. I set up my tent, boiled water for a late lunch, and sat in the dirt next to the water, eating and watching the ripples. It was quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the silence pressed against my ears. I figured it was just because I wasn't used to being so far from town, away from the hum of everything. The first night was uneventful. I heard rustling in the trees a few times, but nothing close, nothing that sounded human. My second day I spent walking around the area, fishing a bit with a collapsible rod I'd packed, and reading. The forest was denser than I'd expected, so dense that once I left the clearing, I couldn't see more than 10 or 15 feet in any direction. That afternoon I hiked halfway around the lake, but the undergrowth got so thick on the far side that I turned back. The ground was soft in places, like it had recently rained, though I hadn't seen any signs of that during the hike in. Around dusk, I was boiling water for dinner when I thought I heard something moving through the trees to the east of the clearing. Something heavier than the usual rustle of small animals. It stopped almost as soon as I noticed it. I waited, listening. Nothing followed. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear moving through the brush. I didn't hear it again that night. That's when I should have left. The third day started foggy. Everything was wet with dew, and the light was gray and dim. I had planned to head out early the next morning, but by noon I was starting to feel like I'd had enough of the woods. I was getting tired of the silence. I felt twitchy, on edge. I decided I'd stay one more night, as planned, but pack up early in the morning and hike out. That afternoon, I went to refill my water bottles from the lake, maybe 40 feet from my tent. The water was clear, shallow near the edge, with small fish darting around near the rocks. I crouched down, started filtering the water, and that's when I noticed the marks. There were footprints in the mud. Not animal prints, human. Bare feet, long, narrow, deeply pressed into the soft bank just past the reach of the grass. I stared at them for a long time, thinking maybe I had somehow walked there barefoot without remembering, but they didn't match my size. They were longer, thinner. The stride was short, uneven, like whoever made them had been limping or moving slowly. There were 6 prints, each one pressed deeply into the mud. Then they vanished into the brush. I stood up, heart pounding, looking around. I didn't see anyone. The woods were still, but the air felt wrong, like it had thickened. I followed the prints a few steps into the trees, but they disappeared quickly. The ground dried out after a few feet, and there was no more mud to leave marks. Still, I searched around, scanning for anything. Snapped branches, clothing, trash, nothing. I backed away and went straight to my tent. I pulled out my knife, checked the bear spray, then sat with my back against a tree, watching the trail in and the trees on the far side of the lake. I told myself maybe it was an old print, but I knew it wasn't. The mud had been soft and wet. The prints were fresh. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent with the rainfly pulled back so I could look out. I had both headlamps in my lap, my knife in my hand. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a stick snap somewhere behind the tent. Then silence. Then another snap, slower, closer. I stayed completely still. My tent was zipped up, but the flap was thin. I couldn't see out in the direction the sound came from.
I sat frozen, listening.
The snapping didn't come back. No footsteps, no movement, just long minutes of silence. Then I heard something soft, like breathing or slow movement in the underbrush. I didn't know how close it was. I wanted to unzip the flap and look, but I couldn't move. I didn't sleep at all. I waited until the light began to creep in, then I slowly packed my gear with shaking hands. I left without eating. My legs were stiff and sore, and I kept looking behind me as I hiked. Every shadow felt wrong. Every bird call made me jump. I moved fast, faster than I should have with a heavy pack, but I didn't stop until I saw my car parked alone in the empty lot. When I reached the door, I stopped. The windshield was dirty, covered in a thin layer of pine dust and pollen, but someone had wiped a streak across the driver's side with their hand. 5 long fingers, clear as day. I stood there for a full minute, staring. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might throw up. I unlocked the car, tossed my gear inside, and drove straight down the mountain road without stopping. My tires kicked up dust, and I hit a few potholes hard enough to rattle the whole frame, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station back near the highway. I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor for a while, shaking. I never found out who it was. I never saw anyone, but I know someone else was out there, walking barefoot around the lake in the middle of the night, watching me. When I got home, I filed a report with the local Forest Service office. They took down the location and said they'd send someone to check the area, but they sounded unconcerned. Just another guy who got spooked in the woods. They said maybe it was a transient or someone living off-grid. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was something else. Something worse, something waiting. I haven't been camping since. Not alone, not in a group, not anywhere. I still have all the gear, but it's packed away in the back of a closet. Sometimes I think about selling it, but I can't bring myself to go through it. I think about those footprints a lot. I think about how quiet the woods were, how the snapping stopped just before I unzipped the tent. I think about the smudge on the windshield, how I was the only car in that lot the whole time. I don't know who was out there, but I know they knew I was alone. I know they were close, and I know they didn't want to be seen. That's enough for me. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Sierra Pelona Mountains of Southern California. I was 32 back then, working as a freelance graphic designer, and I needed to get away from the computer, the phone, and the city. I had been feeling burnt out for weeks. I hadn't taken a break in nearly a year, and everything had started to blur together: emails, deadlines, errands, even sleep. I needed a reset, so I packed up my gear, loaded my backpack into the trunk of my old Toyota Corolla, and headed out early one Friday morning before the sun was even up. I didn't plan anything too elaborate. I had a rough idea of the area I wanted to hike into, somewhere off a fire road where I could go a couple of miles in and pitch a tent near a stream I'd read about on a forum. I wasn't looking for scenic overlooks or anything trendy. I just wanted quiet. I brought along everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, a water filter, a folding knife, a first aid kit, my old beat-up boots, and a lightweight solar charger for my phone, mostly for GPS and emergencies. I didn't plan on using it otherwise. By mid-morning, I had parked near a turnout off the main road and started hiking. The path wasn't well marked. I used a GPS app to keep track of my location and took my time finding a good spot to set up. It was hot, mid-90s, and the sun felt heavy on my back, but I didn't mind. The trail was narrow and shaded by chaparral and scattered oak trees. Everything smelled dry and sun-baked, like warm dust and sage. I hiked about 3 miles in before I found a decent flat spot close to the creek, which wasn't much more than a trickle in the summer. Still, it was enough to refill water and wash up. I set up camp near a boulder that could double as a backrest and cleared out the area for my tent. I made a small fire ring from rocks, though I wasn't planning on using it much due to the fire danger that time of year. I ate some almonds and jerky, washed my face in the creek, and leaned against the boulder as the sun sank low behind the hills. The first night was calm. I listened to the wind push through the trees, the occasional rustle of animals moving in the brush, maybe a raccoon or a fox. I read a few pages from an old paperback, then turned off my headlamp and lay back, staring up at the stars through the mesh roof of my tent. There were no city lights, no sounds of cars or people, just nature. It was exactly what I needed. I slept better that night than I had in months. The second day was uneventful. I woke early, made oatmeal and coffee, then spent the morning walking upstream, exploring a bit. I found an old deer trail and followed it until it became too overgrown. I didn't see anyone all day. No hikers, no campers, just me. That was part of the appeal. I ate lunch sitting on a rock with my feet in the water and watched birds hopping around the branches overhead. Around midday, I headed back to camp, rested in the shade for a while, then went out again to collect more clean water and scout for any signs of wildlife. I didn't want surprises in the middle of the night. As the sun began to go down, I noticed something that I had missed the day before. About 50 yards from my tent, slightly uphill and half hidden behind some brush, was a faint path. It wasn't part of any map or marked trail, just a narrow, beaten-down line through the undergrowth. It looked old, probably made by deer or other animals, but something about it seemed a little too deliberate, a little too clean. I walked a few steps up it, curious, but stopped myself. I wasn't interested in wandering too far from my base camp, especially without knowing where it led. I told myself I'd check it out tomorrow. That night was warmer. I left the tent flaps open for ventilation and dozed off early, exhausted from the hiking. I remember waking up sometime around 2 or 3 a.m., not to a sound, but to a feeling. You know how sometimes you wake up and you're suddenly alert, like your body knows something's off before your brain catches up? That's how it was. I lay still, blinking up at the darkness above me.
No había noise.
No movement outside, but I couldn't shake the unease. I reached quietly for my flashlight, turned it on, and swept the beam around outside the tent. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Still, I couldn't get back to sleep. I sat up, drank a little water, and checked the zipper on the tent just to make sure it was closed. The air was completely still. I lay there awake for another hour before I finally dozed off again. The next morning, I stepped out and noticed something strange in the dirt near my tent. Just a single scuffed area, like someone had stepped and dragged their heel near the edge of the camp. It wasn't clearly a boot print, and it could have been anything, a rabbit kicking up dirt or the wind maybe, but I hadn't seen it there the day before. I crouched down and studied it. Not deep enough to tell much. I didn't think too hard about it, but I felt a little on edge. I had one more full day planned before hiking back out the next morning, so I figured I'd make the most of it. After breakfast, I decided to explore that old path I'd seen. I left a marker of stacked rocks near my tent, just in case I got turned around, and started up the faint trail. It twisted through the trees and brush in a zigzag, heading up a mild incline. The farther I went, the more I noticed that the path seemed almost too straight in places, like it had once been made with intention, not just by wildlife. I found old cut branches, too clean to be natural, probably from years ago. After about 20 minutes of steady walking, I saw what looked like the edge of a clearing ahead. I slowed down. The brush opened up into a small flat area surrounded by dense trees, and right in the center of it was what looked like an old fire pit. Stones in a rough circle, some blackened at the edges. Nearby were broken branches stacked into a crude lean-to. Nothing recent, but definitely man-made. I walked slowly around the clearing, looking for signs of how old it was. The fire pit had bits of metal in it, twisted pieces of what might have been a canteen or a small pan. I crouched to look closer and noticed something odd. Half buried under leaves and dirt was a torn piece of fabric, like canvas. Pulled it out. It was a part of a backpack strap, the plastic clip still attached. Something about it didn't feel right. I looked around more carefully and saw that part of the ground at the far edge of the clearing had been disturbed, like the earth had been dug and then settled again. Not recently, but within the last couple of years, maybe. I stood there for a minute, breathing shallowly, trying to calm down. There was no one around.
No gear.
No bones or anything dramatic. But the combination of the buried strap, the old lean-to, and the disturbed dirt just felt wrong. I turned and walked quickly back down the path toward my camp. I kept checking behind me, but the trail was empty. When I got back, everything looked just as I'd left it. I packed a few things and decided not to stay another night. I didn't want to sleep out there anymore. I wasn't panicked, but I had that deep sense in my gut that said, it's time to go. I'd had my peace and quiet. That was enough. I broke camp quickly. I stuffed my sleeping bag and tent into my pack, triple-checked the area to make sure I wasn't leaving trash, and refilled my water bottle one last time from the creek. By late afternoon, I was back on the trail toward my car. That last part of the hike felt longer than before. I kept hearing small noises behind me, but every time I stopped and looked, there was nothing. Maybe a squirrel or a bird. Still, I kept my knife in my hand the whole way out. My back was tense the entire time. When I finally saw the road and my car through the trees, I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in hours. As I got closer to the car, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The driver's side door was ajar, just barely. I hadn't left it like that. I knew I'd shut it. I walked slowly around, heart pounding, and looked inside. Nothing was missing. Everything was there. My glove box was open, but nothing inside it had been taken. Not my phone charger, not my registration, nothing. I checked the back seat. It was empty. I started the car and drove off without wasting another second. I didn't even stop to eat. I drove the whole way home with the windows down and my eyes bouncing from the road to the rearview mirror. When I got home, I cleaned my gear, showered, and sat on the floor of my apartment, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't see anything directly threatening. No one confronted me. No weapons, no chase, nothing like that. But something had been off. That old path, the disturbed dirt, the broken lean-to, the strap buried in the ground. And someone had been close enough to my car to open it. I didn't report it to the police because I didn't have anything concrete to give them. What could I say? That I saw an old campsite and found a strap? That my door had been cracked open? Nothing was stolen and no one was hurt. But I know what I felt. I know I wasn't alone out there. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still love the outdoors, and I'll hike with friends or spend time in nature. But I don't go off-grid by myself anymore. That trip reminded me that peace and quiet can sometimes hide something else entirely. Something you can't see until you're too deep to turn back. And whatever happened out there, whatever was hiding in those trees, it made its point. The day I decided to go camping alone was one I'll never forget. It wasn't a plan made out of excitement or adventure. It was more like an escape, a way to get away from the noise of the city and the stress that seemed to pile on every single day. I wanted silence. I wanted nature. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do this on my own. I packed my backpack the night before. It was a simple pack, a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water, a small stove, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I didn't want to carry too much. The spot I chose was about 4 hours from the city, deep in the forest near a river I had heard about from an old hiking blog. The blog talked about how peaceful it was there, how few people visited. Perfect. I left early in the morning before the sun even rose. The road to the trailhead was narrow and winding, cutting through endless stretches of tall pine trees. The smell of pine needles and wet earth filled the air around my car. It was the first real breath of fresh air I had taken in weeks. I parked in a small clearing, grabbed my pack, and started the hike. The trail was rough but clear, a dirt path covered in fallen leaves and broken twigs. The trees here were huge, older than anything I had seen in the city park. Their branches blocked the sky in places, letting only slivers of light through. As I walked, I noticed how the forest was alive with small sounds. Birds chirped high in the trees, insects buzzed near the bushes, and the wind made the leaves whisper. It was calming. My legs ached a bit, but the steady rhythm of my footsteps kept me moving forward. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes climbing up rocky hills, other times dipping down towards small streams. About 2 hours in, I reached a small clearing. There was a fallen log near a patch of wildflowers. I sat down to catch my breath and drink some water. The sun was higher now, and the warmth spread through the cool air. I pulled out my phone to check the map one last time, even though I was sure I knew the way. The signal was weak, but it showed I was close to the river. After a quick rest, I stood up and continued. Soon I could hear the sound of water rushing nearby. The river was just ahead, winding through the forest with clear, cold water. It was wider than I expected, with rocks and small rapids that splashed as the water moved over them. The banks were lined with smooth stones and tall grass. I found a good spot to set up my tent on a flat area about 20 feet from the water. The ground was soft but dry. I unpacked my gear and carefully pitched the tent, making sure the stakes were secure. Setting up the camp took time, but I enjoyed it. It felt good to work with my hands and be so close to nature. Once the tent was ready, I gathered some dry wood from nearby and built a small fire pit. The smell of smoke mixed with the forest's fresh air. I boiled some water on my small stove, made a simple meal of instant noodles, and ate while watching the river flow. The sound of water was steady and soothing. As the afternoon passed into evening, the forest began to change. Shadows grew longer, and the colors shifted from green to deep blues and blacks. I lit a lantern and sat outside my tent, listening. The birds stopped singing, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustle of small animals moving in the underbrush. I felt good, but also a little uneasy. It was normal, I told myself. Being alone in the forest at night wasn't something I did often. I checked my flashlight, made sure my phone was charged, and crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The night was quiet for a while, but I was still alert. Every little noise made me tense up. At one point, I heard a sharp crack not far from the tent. It wasn't the kind of sound made by falling branches or animals I knew. It was heavier, like something big stepping on dry wood. I stayed still and listened. The sound came again, Slow footsteps moving closer, then stopping for a moment, then moving away. My heart pounded. I reminded myself that bears lived in these woods, and that maybe it was just one wandering nearby. I hadn't seen any signs, but it was a possibility. I tried to calm down, telling myself the bear would not come close to my fire or tent. I lay awake for hours, flashlight by my side. The night sounds continued, distant rustling, twigs snapping here and there, leaves crunching under something's weight. Each noise felt louder in the silence. I imagined eyes watching me from the dark, but I refused to let fear take hold. At some point, I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke, the sky was just starting to lighten. The first hint of dawn was spilling through the tent's mesh window. I felt tired but safe. I got out of the tent, stretched, and went to the river to wash my face. The water was cold, crisp, and refreshing. I sat on a rock for a moment, watching the mist rise from the river as the sun came up fully. I started packing my gear to leave. The woods looked different in the daylight, less frightening, more alive. I decided to take the same trail back, feeling more confident. The hike out was easier. Birds sang again. The sun warmed my skin, and the forest's beauty was undeniable. Halfway back to my car, I noticed something odd on the ground. A set of footprints in the soft dirt. They were large, definitely not mine or any animals I recognized. The prints were too deep, with a shape that looked human but bigger, heavier. I stopped and looked around. There was no one else on the trail. The footprints led off the path, toward the river. A cold feeling spread through me, but I pushed it aside. Maybe someone else was camping nearby. It wasn't a remote area after all, just quiet. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a moment. My phone finally got full signal. I called my friend to tell them I was okay and would be home soon. The relief of hearing a familiar voice was immediate, even if it was only on the phone. Driving away, I looked back at the forest, the place that had felt both peaceful and threatening. I thought about the footprints and the noises I heard. Maybe it was someone else, a lost hiker, someone camping illegally, or just a person passing through. The experience taught me something important. Being alone in nature means being aware, cautious, and respectful of the unknown. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about real dangers, animals, people, the wilderness itself. That trip stayed with me, not as a story of fear, but as a reminder that nature demands attention and respect. I came back safe but more aware, and I knew that next time, I'd be better prepared and more careful, because the woods aren't just beautiful. They can be dangerous in ways you don't always expect. I took a week off in July of 2017 to get out of the city. Work had been pressing down on me for months. Long days, barely any sleep, no time to really stop and breathe. My apartment sat right on the edge of a busy road in downtown Portland, and even with earplugs, I never felt like I was truly resting. I just needed quiet, stillness, something to reset my head. So I packed up my old Toyota 4Runner, tossed my camping gear in the back, and drove northeast into the Mount Hood National Forest. I didn't have a plan, just a few maps, a rough idea of the weather, and a full tank of gas. I figured I'd find some trails, hike for a while, and set up camp somewhere away from people. I liked that kind of camping, no campsites, no restrooms, no designated fire pits. Just find a stretch of forest nobody else is using and make it home for a few days. I stopped in a small town called Estacada for some food and water. The last bit of cell signal I had was gone about 20 minutes past the edge of town. After that, it was just forest roads and quiet. By late afternoon, I found a trail that didn't look like it had been used much recently. There were no cars parked nearby, no footprints in the dirt. The trail cut up a ridge, then looped down along the east face of a hill that overlooked a wide ravine with a slow-moving creek at the bottom. I hiked in for about 2 hours before I found a flat spot tucked behind a group of thick evergreens. It was hidden enough that I couldn't see the trail anymore. Perfect. The first evening was calm. I got the tent set up, rolled out my sleeping bag, and boiled some water for instant noodles. The bugs weren't too bad yet, just a few flies and gnats buzzing around. As the sun went down, Everything got quiet in that way only deep woods do. I could hear my own heartbeat if I stood still. When the stars came out, I crawled into the tent and laid there, watching shadows of branches dance along the walls of the nylon. I woke up once in the night to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the crunch of leaves or a stick breaking somewhere off to the side. I stayed still, listening, but it never got closer. Probably a raccoon or something small looking for food. I didn't even bother unzipping the tent. I just lay there with my hand on the handle of my hatchet until I drifted off again. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I had brought a small day pack with some essentials, so I filled it with water, a snack, a lighter, and a few basic tools, then set out. The trail was even more overgrown past where I had left it the day before. At some point, it stopped looking like a real trail and more like an old game trail animals had used. I kept going anyway, just curious to see where it led. It dropped down near the creek, where I found a few old tree stumps that looked like they'd been logged years ago, probably decades. A few rusted nails stuck out of one of them. Maybe an old logging camp had been nearby at some point. I followed the creek for a while, walking over slick rocks and ducking under branches. After maybe 2 hours, I came across something I didn't expect. An old tent, collapsed and torn, sitting at the edge of a thicket of brush. It looked like it had been there for years. The nylon was faded, the poles were snapped, and most of it was buried under pine needles and dirt. Nearby, I saw what looked like the remains of a fire pit, just some scattered stones and half-burned wood. There were even a few rusted cans and some plastic wrappers poking up from the dirt. It had definitely been a camp, but it wasn't clear how long ago. It gave me an odd feeling. Not fear exactly, just unease, like I was seeing something I wasn't meant to find. I looked around for any signs of who had been there, but there wasn't much. No wallet or ID, no names written on anything, just decay. I poked at the debris for a minute, then moved on. I hiked another couple miles downstream and marked a few trees with some tape I kept in my bag to make sure I could find my way back. It wasn't until the light started changing that I realized how far I'd gone. I turned back, retracing my steps, but the woods never looked the same going the other direction. I found the tape eventually, but it took longer than I expected. By the time I got back to my own camp, the sun was almost gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound put me on edge. I kept thinking about the ruined tent. Who had left it there? Why hadn't they packed up? I listened for noises, branches snapping, distant footsteps, but everything was dead silent. At one point, I sat up, unzipped the tent, and just stared into the trees for a long time. Nothing moved. I finally laid back down and tried to close my eyes, but even then I only drifted in and out of shallow sleep. The next morning, I felt uneasy, like something was wrong, but I couldn't say what. I told myself it was just being alone in the woods. That kind of quiet place tricks on you. But then I noticed something strange. A stick I had leaned against my fire pit was lying several feet away. My folding chair was knocked over. Small things that could have been the wind, but there hadn't been any wind that night. I started to feel a little less sure about staying another day. I figured I'd stay one more night just to prove to myself that nothing was wrong, then pack up and head out the next morning. I tried to keep busy. I gathered more firewood, filtered water from the creek, and took another short hike up a ridge to get some views. The weather was perfect, but I felt like I couldn't relax. Every sound made my head snap around. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the trees, a dark shape, maybe a person, but when I walked that way, there was nothing, just brush, maybe a shadow, maybe nothing. That night, I built a bigger fire than usual. I kept it going longer, too, past midnight. I sat on the ground with my back against a tree and just stared at the flames. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't hear a single animal, not even the usual night sounds. No crickets, no owls. I knew that was a bad sign. It meant something else was nearby. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there with my knife in my hand and waited for the sun. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed up fast. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just threw everything into my backpack, stomped out the fire, and got moving. I had about 2 hours of hiking to get back to the trailhead, and I didn't want to waste a second. The whole way back, I felt like I was being watched. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone, but the trail stayed empty. When I reached the car, I tossed my gear in the back without even organizing it, climbed in, and locked the doors. I didn't feel safe until I had driven 10 miles back toward the town. I stopped at a gas station, used the bathroom, and just sat in the parking lot for a while trying to shake the feeling. Eventually, I drove the rest of the way home and spent the evening going through my gear, making sure nothing was missing. That should have been the end of it. Just a weird trip. But 2 days later, I got a call from a ranger with the Forest Service. I had registered my backcountry permit online, so they had my number. He asked if I had seen anything unusual. I told him about the old tent I found, and he asked me to describe it in detail. Then he went quiet for a while. Finally, he told me a man had gone missing in that area in 2009. His family never found out what happened. The description of the gear I found matched his. I asked if they were going to check it out again, and the ranger said they would send someone. That was it. I never heard back. A few weeks later, I was reorganizing my camping box and found something that didn't belong. A knife. It wasn't mine. The handle was old and cracked, and the blade had initials carved into it, JM. I looked it up. That was the same name as the guy who went missing. I still don't know how it got into my pack. I never picked it up. I would have remembered that, but it was there, wedged in the side pocket. I mailed it to the ranger's office anonymously. I didn't want to answer any more questions. I didn't want to be involved. I haven't been back to that forest since. I still go camping, but only in open places now, with clear sight lines and other people nearby. I bring less gear and keep my trips short. I don't go looking for old trails anymore. I don't explore abandoned camps. I just wanted to rest that week. I never expected to walk into someone else's unfinished story, but I did. And I think whoever it was, maybe they never left. Maybe they were still out there, just waiting for someone to notice. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the northern part of Idaho, near a stretch of national forest I hadn't been to before. I had camped dozens of times over the years, usually with friends or my younger brother, but this time I wanted to be completely alone. The stress of work and city life had been stacking up, and I needed to get away from everything. No phones, no people, no noise. I had no real plan beyond spending 4 days in the woods, hiking, cooking over a fire, sleeping in my tent, and just clearing my head. I picked a place called Faro Ridge because I'd heard it wasn't too crowded, even during summer. It wasn't totally unknown. Hunters and backpackers used the trails there, but it wasn't one of those polished campgrounds with numbered spots and fire rings either. The place was more rugged, with a few old forest roads and some dispersed camping areas deeper into the trees. I figured I'd be far enough from others to feel that solitude I was looking for, but close enough to civilization that if I really needed help, I could hike back to my truck or find a ranger station. I drove out on a Thursday morning, reaching the tree line by noon. My truck was loaded with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, water filter, food for several days, a hatchet, a hunting knife, flashlight, headlamp, bear spray, the works. I also brought a paper map because I didn't want to rely on GPS. I parked near a gate that blocked off a rarely used fire road and hiked 2 miles in with my pack until I found a flat clearing tucked between a line of dense pine trees and a small rocky incline. It felt isolated, clean, and just a little bit overgrown. Perfect. By late afternoon, I had my tent up, a small fire going, and a pot of water boiling for some instant noodles. Everything was quiet. The sun filtered through the trees, birds chirped, and I could hear the occasional snapping of sticks from a deer or maybe just squirrels. I ate my dinner slowly, just watching the woods around me. It felt good to not be staring at a screen or stuck in traffic. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sounds of wind moving through the pines and insects buzzing. I woke up once around 3 to pee and stood outside my tent for a few minutes. The sky was full of stars, and the air was cold enough to make me shiver in my socks. I didn't see or hear anything strange. I climbed back in and fell asleep quickly. The second day, I woke up early and spent most of the morning hiking a nearby ridge. I carried my day pack, brought a snack, and marked the trail with small pieces of flagging tape I tied to branches, just in case I lost my way. The forest was dense but beautiful. I saw a few elk in the distance and what I'm pretty sure was a black bear about 50 yards off, moving away from me fast once it caught my scent. The woods were alive, but not in a threatening way. More like they were indifferent to me, like I was just passing through. That night, I stayed up later by the fire, carving a piece of dry wood I'd found into a sort of spoon, just to kill time. It wasn't until I was putting out the fire and getting ready for bed that I noticed something strange. One of the pieces of tape I'd used to mark my hiking path earlier was lying on the ground near my tent. It had been tied to a tree about half a mile up the ridge, and I was sure of it because I only brought a small roll and I remembered each one I'd used. I stared at it for a while, thinking maybe the wind had blown it down and carried it all the way to camp. But that didn't make much sense. There hadn't been any strong wind, and the tape was tied tight. It shouldn't have come off that easily. I felt a bit uneasy, but I didn't have a good reason to be alarmed. Animals tugging on things, gravity, whatever. I tossed the tape into my trash bag and climbed into my sleeping bag. That night, I had a hard time falling asleep. I kept hearing twigs snap outside. Not constantly, just one or two every 20 minutes. Could have been deer, but the steps sounded heavier sometimes. I kept grabbing my flashlight and shining it outside through the mesh, but I never saw anything. Around 1 a.m., I finally drifted off. The third day was when everything really started to feel off. When I woke up, I found that a small pile of stones had been placed next to my tent. Not kicked over or tumbled randomly, actually stacked. There were 5 stones, flat ones, balanced on each other in a narrow column about a foot tall. I didn't build it. I hadn't even seen stones like that near camp. I walked a slow circle around the area, looking for signs of tracks, but the dirt was packed too tight, and there was too much pine litter on the ground to see anything clear. My first instinct was to think maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe there was another camper nearby who thought it was funny. But I hadn't heard or seen a single person since I hiked in. No voices, no distant campfires, no footprints on the trail. I stood there for a long time just staring at the rocks. Then I knocked them over and tossed the stones into the trees. I debated packing up and leaving, but it was only day 3. I told myself it was probably just some harmless weirdo trying to be creepy for laughs. I had bear spray, a knife, and I kept my axe near the tent flap. I'd be fine. That's what I told myself anyway. I decided not to go far that day. I stayed close to camp, gathering firewood and filtering more water from a stream about 100 yards away. I kept looking over my shoulder. It wasn't that I was hearing anything, just this growing feeling that someone was watching. That's the part that's hard to explain. The woods looked the same, sounded the same, but something had shifted. It felt like I wasn't alone, and it wasn't the good kind of solitude I'd wanted. It was something else. That night, I built a bigger fire and sat up later than usual. I kept the flashlight in my lap and listened harder than before. Around 10 p.m., I heard something deeper in the woods. Not just twigs snapping this time, but something moving slow, careful, like someone walking on the balls of their feet. I turned off the fire completely and sat in the dark, letting my eyes adjust. It didn't take long. I saw a figure move between 2 trees maybe 30 feet away. No flashlight, no campfire, just a silhouette. I didn't yell or move. I just sat still, staring. Whoever it was didn't come closer. They stood there for a few seconds, maybe realizing I could see them, and then stepped back into the trees. I never heard them run or walk away. They just disappeared into the dark. That was enough. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with my knife in one hand and the bear spray in the other, the headlamp strapped to my forehead. Every tiny sound outside made me freeze. When the sky finally started to lighten, I stepped out and broke camp as fast as I could. I didn't even make coffee or eat breakfast. I packed everything into my bag and hiked back the 2 miles to my truck without stopping. When I got back to the fire road, my truck looked fine at first. Then I noticed something carved into the driver's side door with a sharp object. It wasn't a word, just a long, thin X. The paint was peeled back, cut deep into the metal. I checked the rest of the truck, started it, and everything worked. But my heart was hammering. I drove straight back to town without stopping. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. What was I going to say? That someone followed me into the woods and watched me for 3 days without ever speaking? Left signs, and then marked my truck? It all sounded too strange, too paranoid. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I wasn't alone out there. Weeks later, I started digging into stories online, trying to see if anyone else had weird experiences near Faro Ridge. I didn't find much, just a few mentions on old forums, people talking about missing hikers or strange campsite vandalism. One person mentioned finding stack stones in odd places too, but no one had answers.
No eres, no suspects.
Nothing clear. I haven't been camping alone since. I still hike and I still love the woods, but I stay close to well-used trails, and I always let someone know where I'm going. I never went back to that spot, and I never will. That trip taught me something I didn't expect. People are a lot scarier than the woods. It's not bears or storms or getting lost that gets under your skin. It's the thought that someone could be out there with you, watching, waiting, doing just enough to make you wonder if you're going crazy. And they never show their face. They don't have to. That's what stays with me most. Not knowing who it was or what they wanted. Just the fact that they were there. It was the end of June 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I was 29 at the time, working remotely for a small graphic design company, and needed a break from the endless stream of client revisions and emails. I'd grown up in a suburb just outside Chicago, but I'd spent a lot of time in northern Michigan during my childhood. Family trips to the woods, fishing with my grandfather, quiet walks through pine forests that smelled like earth and old sap. I missed that kind of stillness. I chose a small, somewhat remote state forest about a 2-hour drive northwest of Marquette. It wasn't completely off-grid, but it was far enough that cell service dropped off about 20 minutes before I reached the park entrance. The place wasn't popular, and the campsites were first come, first serve. That suited me fine. I wasn't looking to socialize or even really be around people. I just wanted some peace and space to reset my head. The forest road leading in was gravel, uneven, and peppered with potholes. My old Subaru Outback handled it well enough, though I had to slow to a crawl in certain areas. The trees on either side of the road grew dense, tall, and dark, with sunlight breaking through only in narrow shafts. When I finally reached the campsite area, there were maybe 10 sites total. I only saw one other car parked on the far end, an old Chevy pickup with rust along the wheel wells and a bed full of firewood. No sign of the owner. I picked a spot farthest from them, a flat area backed by trees, with a stone fire ring and a broken picnic table that leaned slightly to one side. Perfect. I parked and started unloading. Tent, sleeping bag, folding chair, food container, water jugs, stove. I had enough supplies to last 4 nights, maybe 5 if I rationed carefully. I wasn't planning anything elaborate, just reading, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. The air smelled of pine needles and the faint trace of campfire smoke, probably from that other site. I pitched the tent near a soft patch of grass and laid out my sleeping bag. After setting up camp, I sat in my chair with a granola bar and a bottle of water and just listened. No cars, no phones, no voices, just birdsong, wind in the trees, and the occasional scurry of some small animal in the brush. It was exactly what I needed. That first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili on my little gas stove and watched the fire until the stars came out. It was cold once the sun went down, colder than I expected for late June. I pulled on a hoodie and zipped the sleeping bag up tight before turning in. I slept deeply, waking only once when something rustled outside the tent. It wasn't close, maybe 20 feet off, but loud enough to stir me. I lay still for a few minutes, listening, but whatever it was moved off and didn't come back. Probably a raccoon or a porcupine. I'd seen both around before. Still, I kept the hatchet close just in case. The next day, I woke early, cooked some oatmeal, and went hiking. There were a few marked trails that looped through the woods and circled a small lake about 1.5 miles from camp. I took my time, stopping to take pictures and watch a deer cross the path up ahead. I didn't see another soul the entire day. No hikers, no rangers, nothing. When I got back to camp, I noticed something strange. My folding chair had been moved, subtly, just a few inches to the left of where I'd left it, but I remembered exactly where I'd placed it. I always lined it up facing the fire pit. This time, it was turned slightly off-center. I looked around for tracks or signs that someone had been through, but the pine needles covering the ground made it hard to tell. Nothing seemed stolen or damaged. Maybe a gust of wind had knocked it, but it hadn't been windy. I brushed it off and sat down, shaking off the unease. That night, I couldn't fall asleep as easily. Something about the stillness had shifted. It wasn't the usual quiet I'd always found comforting. Felt heavier somehow, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept the fire going longer, adding small pieces of dry wood just to keep some light and movement around me. Eventually, I forced myself to crawl into the tent. I zipped it up and laid there, staring at the fabric above me. My ears strained for every sound: the wind, the creak of branches, distant owls. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly, not to a noise but to a feeling, like something was close. I stayed perfectly still. Then I heard it, a very faint, slow crunch of pine needles just outside the tent. Not an animal scurrying, something heavier, more deliberate. One step, then silence, then another, then nothing again. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, whatever it was moved away. I heard nothing else that night. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and scanned the clearing. Nothing looked out of place. But when I walked a slow circle around the site, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Near a small tree behind the tent, just at the edge of the clearing, there was a mark in the dirt. Not a full footprint, but the heel of a boot. Deep enough to be fresh. It wasn't mine. I'd never walked that way, and it wasn't near a trail or path. I kept trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe a hiker had come through and got turned around. Maybe someone else was camping off-trail nearby. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I packed up some of my gear and drove into town that afternoon. It was about a 45-minute drive on winding roads. I grabbed a sandwich at a gas station, filled up my tank, and debated whether to come back or just find a motel. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that I needed this trip, that the solitude was messing with my head. So I drove back. When I got to camp, everything looked just as I'd left it. Nothing missing, nothing moved. But I couldn't relax. That evening, I kept my axe in my lap while I sat by the fire. I barely ate. Every little sound made me look over my shoulder. As the sun started to go down, I walked the perimeter of the campsite again. That's when I saw it. Tied around the base of a tree low to the ground was a length of fishing line. Thin, almost invisible in the fading light. It stretched across the narrow gap between 2 trees, about ankle height. It hadn't been there before. I crouched and followed the line with my fingers. It was tied tight, deliberate. I followed it around the tree and found it connected to a second piece of line, running off into the woods. My mouth went dry. This wasn't something a random camper would do for fun. This was a trap. Not the kind for animals either. This was set at the exact height to trip a person walking in the dark. I cut the line and took it back to camp. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up by the fire, axe in hand, flashlight close, straining my ears for any sign of movement. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Slow steps in the brush, circling wide around the clearing. Not close, but close enough to make the hair stand up on my arms. I turned off the lantern and waited in the dark, only the firelight flickering. The steps moved away after a while. I didn't follow. I was done with being curious. At first light, I packed everything into the Subaru. I didn't even bother rolling up the tent, just stuffed it in the back. I was about to start the engine when I noticed something on the ground behind one of the rear tires. A single cigarette butt, still fresh, still warm. I hadn't smoked a cigarette in over 5 years. I got in, locked the doors, and drove straight out of that place, bouncing hard over every pothole, not caring. I didn't stop until I reached a diner an hour south, where I ordered coffee and sat shaking, trying to process everything. Later that week, back home, I reported the incident to the DNR. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard anything back. I never went camping alone again after that. I still love the woods, still hike when I can, but I stay on marked trails in busier parks and never too far from my car. It wasn't ghosts or monsters that scared me. It was the realization that someone else had been out there, watching, moving around my site in the dark, setting traps, waiting. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who might have done something worse if I hadn't left when I did. That trip changed the way I see solitude. There's a kind of quiet that's peaceful and a kind that isn't. You don't really understand the difference until you hear footsteps in the dark and realize you're not alone. And whoever's out there doesn't want you to know they're there. I decided to go camping alone in September of 2018, after a long stretch of working in an office that seemed to take more from me every week. I'd saved up some time off and I wanted a break. No phone, no screens, no traffic or alarms, just the woods. I picked a place I hadn't been to before, up in northern Idaho, near Priest Lake. I'd read it wasn't too crowded that time of year, and I liked the idea of being around water but also near some decent trails. I packed my gear carefully, went over my list twice, and even brought an old paper map of the area. I wasn't planning to be reckless, just quiet. I drove up from Spokane early in the morning, reached the trailhead by about 10 a.m., and parked my car at a small, open gravel area that was half full. There were a few other vehicles there, older pickups, a Subaru with bike racks, nothing out of place. The air was cool, probably mid-50s, and everything smelled like pine and dry leaves. I felt good. I hiked out about 5 or 6 miles with my pack, following a path that ran along the west side of the lake before breaking off into a thinner trail that cut through a heavily forested area. My plan was to set up camp about a mile off that smaller trail, somewhere near a clearing I'd marked on my map. The first few hours were uneventful, just the rhythm of hiking, the sounds of birds, squirrels, the wind passing through trees. I barely saw anyone, just one older couple on their way back out, maybe a half hour in. After that, it was all mine. The forest got denser as I went farther in. The trail narrowed and sloped upward for a while, then dropped back down into a valley with thick brush on both sides. I moved slower through there. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen. There's a silence in those parts that almost hums, especially when there's no one around. You notice every twig snap. Every squirrel sounds like a bear until you see it dart up a tree. I reached the clearing just before 3 p.m. It was a wide, flat spot surrounded by tall evergreens, with just enough open space to let in some sun. The ground was soft but dry, covered in pine needles and old leaves. About 50 yards to the south was a small, slow-moving creek. I set up my tent a bit farther from the water, under a tree where the ground was a little more even. I unpacked slowly, pacing myself, not in a hurry. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, gathered wood, and boiled some water for coffee. It was a calm, easy afternoon. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. The first night passed without anything strange. I heard animals moving in the brush, probably raccoons or deer, and once or twice I woke up to the sound of wind shaking the trees, but nothing alarming. I got up with the light, made some oatmeal, and decided to do a loop trail that started a mile north of camp. It took me up through some steeper hills and passed through a dense section of pine before opening up to a rock overlook. The view of the lake from there was unreal. No sound, no buildings, no boats, just water and trees. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. I made dinner, read a few chapters of an old paperback I brought, and sat quietly as the sun dipped below the trees. Everything felt the way I wanted it to feel, peaceful, disconnected. That changed the next day. I woke up around 6 a.m., still groggy, and noticed right away that something felt different. I couldn't name it at first. The air was colder, but not in a normal morning chill kind of way. It was more like the temperature had dropped sharply overnight. The inside of my tent felt damp. When I stepped outside, the entire area was covered in dew. But there was also this strange quiet that made me uneasy. Not the usual peaceful quiet, more like everything had gone still. No birds, no wind, just cold, wet silence. I walked around a bit, thinking maybe it was just early. Sometimes the woods are quiet before sunrise. I went to the creek to wash my face and refill my water bottle. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the opposite bank of the creek, maybe 20 yards into the trees, there was a pile of branches. At first, I thought it was just a natural tangle, maybe something fallen during a storm. But the shape was too neat. It was stacked, arranged. 5 or 6 thick branches leaning together like a low teepee, with smaller sticks woven around the base. I didn't see that there the day before. I would have noticed. I looked at it for a long time. It didn't seem like something a person would build for shelter. It wasn't large enough, and it didn't look lived in. No tarp, no tools or trash, just sticks. I crossed the creek and got closer. The ground near it was disturbed. Dirt turned up in patches, a few broken pieces of bark. I looked for tracks but didn't see any clear ones. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring at it. My gut told me not to mess with it. Maybe someone built it as a marker or for some kind of hunting trap. I didn't hear anything nearby. No signs of people. No scent of smoke or any camp sounds. I walked back across the creek and tried to shake it off. All day I felt off. Every time I sat still, I thought I heard movement in the woods. Small steps, like someone walking slowly through leaves, stopping whenever I listened too hard. I didn't see anything, though. Once, I thought I heard breathing just behind a tree to the west of my sight. But when I moved closer, there was nothing. I kept thinking about that pile. Who built it? Why they're in a spot barely off a narrow trail that only hikers really use. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing little noises, soft thuds, brush snapping, the sound of something dragging lightly against the ground. I turned my headlamp on twice and sat up in the tent, but I couldn't see anything through the mesh. I zipped it up and tried to stay calm. Every part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but it was after midnight, and I wasn't going to hike out in the dark. I kept telling myself it was just animals. Maybe a porcupine, maybe raccoons. I forced myself to stay inside the tent. Just before dawn, I heard something that still sticks with me. The sound of a zipper. Not mine, not from my tent, but it was close, maybe 10 feet away. Just a slow, smooth zipper sound, like someone opening a backpack. I froze. I didn't move or breathe. The sound didn't repeat, just that one zip. Then nothing. I waited until full light before stepping out. Everything looked the same. Nothing missing from my gear. Nothing disturbed. But about 10 feet away, near a log I'd sat on the day before, was a long, black nylon strap. Not mine. Just a single loose strap, maybe from a duffel bag or a backpack. I checked all my gear again. Everything I brought was intact. That strap hadn't been there before. It looked old, a little frayed at one end, but not rotten. I stared at it for a long time before I picked it up. I put it in a side pocket of my pack. I don't know why I didn't just leave it there. By noon, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed everything, not neatly, just fast. I ate a granola bar standing up, didn't make coffee, didn't take pictures. I just wanted out. I didn't care if I had to hike all day. The trail was mostly downhill going back, and I figured I could make it before sunset if I pushed hard. I took one last look around the clearing, checking for anything left behind, and then I started walking. The first few miles were uneventful. The woods were still quiet, but not as bad as before. I even started to think maybe I'd overreacted. The pile of sticks could have been anything. The noises, the strap. Maybe someone had camped nearby the previous week and left stuff behind. It happens. Then I reached the part of the trail that passed through the narrow valley with thick brush on both sides. It was darker there, even in daylight. The air smelled damp and old. As I moved through it, I noticed something strange. Scratches on the trees. Not claw marks. These were too straight. More like knife marks. long vertical slices about 4 or 5 feet up the trunk. I saw them on 3 trees in a row, evenly spaced along the path. Each mark was fresh. The bark was pale underneath, still moist. I stopped and looked around. Nothing but trees and brush. No sound. I kept moving faster now. About half a mile later, I heard movement behind me. A crunch of leaves, then a pause. I turned quickly, heart pounding, but I didn't see anything. I crouched, listening. Another soft step. It was behind a tree just off the trail. I waited. It didn't move again. I kept walking, faster than before, trying not to run. I didn't want to fall or lose the trail, but the sense that I was being followed didn't go away. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen. Sometimes I'd hear something, sometimes I wouldn't, but the feeling stayed, heavy and cold, crawling up the back of my neck. I reached the trailhead just before 5 p.m. My car was still there, so were the others. Nothing broken, nothing moved. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a full 5 minutes before I started the engine. I didn't look back. When I got home, I threw the strap in the garbage. I didn't want to keep it, but I also did. I left early on a Thursday morning, trying to beat traffic out of town. I packed the car the night before so I wouldn't forget anything: tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra fuel, knife, rope, plenty of water, and a couple of freeze-dried meals. I was going to be out in the wilderness for 3 nights. Just me, some forest in northern Montana, and a campsite I'd read about online. It wasn't a marked campground or anything. Someone in a hiking forum mentioned a flat clearing near a small lake that was off the main trail by a few miles. They said it was peaceful, quiet, and far enough from everything that you could sit there and feel like you were the only person on Earth. That sounded perfect to me. I'd been feeling boxed in by the city. Crowded trains, loud neighbors, the constant sound of sirens and traffic. I wanted real silence, not the kind of quiet where you still hear cars in the distance or airplanes overhead. I wanted actual silence. So I aimed for that lake, packed light but smart, and drove for nearly 7 hours until the highway turned to gravel. And then gravel turned to a rough dirt road that dead-ended in a small turnaround surrounded by trees. From there, I hiked about 5 miles with my pack on. The first part followed a marked trail that cut through pine and fir trees. After 2 hours, I veered off using GPS coordinates I'd downloaded in advance. That's when it started to feel different. No more trail markers, just dense trees, rocks, and uneven ground. But the GPS still worked fine, and after another hour or so, I reached the spot. It really was beautiful. A wide clearing ringed by tall evergreens, with a flat section of grass big enough to pitch a tent. About 50 feet away, down a short slope, was the lake, small, maybe 70 yards across, with perfectly still water and mossy rocks around the edges. There was no trash, no fire rings, nothing that said people had been here recently. Just nature. I took off my pack and stretched. My back ached from carrying the load so long, but I felt good. It was quiet. Not a single voice, no tires crunching gravel, no hum of air conditioning. Just the light breeze in the trees and a few birds. That was it. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing where the grass was soft and the ground was dry. I laid out my sleeping bag, hung up my food in a bag tied high in a tree just in case of animals, and sat down by the lake. I stayed there for a long time, just listening and watching the sun dip lower over the water. That first night was calm. I cooked one of my meals over the little gas stove, ate slow, then packed everything up and zipped myself into the tent before it got too cold. I didn't hear anything unusual. No rustling, no movement. I fell asleep quickly and didn't wake up until the sun lit the inside of the tent the next morning. The second day, I walked around the lake a bit, following deer trails and game tracks that wound through the trees. I didn't go too far. I didn't want to get turned around. I took some pictures, found a dry log to sit on for a while, and ate lunch near the water again. The air was fresh, and the quiet still amazed me. No planes, no distant voices, just wind and birds. That night, I went to sleep the same way. Stomach full, gear packed up, food bag high in a tree. I lay on my back in the tent, listening to the breeze. But this time, something was off. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know what time it was exactly, but it was pitch black inside the tent. I couldn't hear anything at first, just the usual quiet. But then I picked up on something different. It was faint, really faint, but it sounded like a crunch, like something stepping on leaves. I froze and held my breath. The sound didn't come again right away. I waited, breathing shallow, listening hard. Then I heard it again. Another soft crunch. Then a pause. Then two more. It was slow and light. Not the heavy kind of thud you'd get from a person walking in boots, but not quite like a deer either. I'd heard deer move through the woods before. They were usually quicker. This sounded cautious, almost like something trying not to be heard. I stayed still. My knife was just beside me, and I slowly reached over and grabbed it. I didn't unzip the tent or make any noise. I just waited. The sounds faded after a while. I must have stayed awake for an hour, maybe longer, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already up. I got out of the tent, stretched, and looked around. There was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no claw marks, nothing moved or touched. The food bag was still tied up in the tree. Everything looked fine. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal passing through, maybe a raccoon or something smaller. Still, the sound stuck in my head. That day, I didn't go far. I stayed near the tent, read for a bit, made sure everything was in place. I still had one more night before heading back. Felt strange now, like the silence had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavier. The woods felt tighter, like they were pressing in closer than before. That third night, I double-checked everything. I cooked early and cleaned up right after. I even moved my tent a little closer to the food bag tree, closer to the middle of the clearing, farther from the trees. I wanted more space around me, more room to react if I needed to. I kept the knife closer too, just in case. Again, I fell asleep, but it was lighter sleep this time. My brain kept waiting for a sound, and eventually it came. This time it was clearer. I heard the same soft crunch of footsteps, but they were closer than before. Slower too, more deliberate. Then a long pause, then another set. It was like someone or something was circling, not in a rush, just taking time. I held the knife in my hand and stayed still. The footsteps stopped. For several minutes I heard nothing, and then I heard breathing. Not mine, heavy but low, like someone standing just outside the tent. Not moving, not touching the fabric, just standing there, breathing. I didn't move, I didn't make a sound. I just lay there holding the knife, heart pounding. After maybe 5 minutes, the breathing stopped. I didn't hear it move away, it just stopped. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. I waited until it was bright enough to see shadows through the tent, then unzipped it slowly and stepped out. There were footprints this time. They weren't boot prints or anything clear, just the faint impression of something barefoot, maybe human-sized. They circled the tent once, then stopped, right at the front. That was it for me. I packed fast, barely even ate breakfast. I stuffed everything into the pack, tore down the tent, and slung the food bag down without checking it. I wanted out. Whatever had been out there, I didn't want to meet it face to face. I started hiking back the way I came. GPS in hand, eyes scanning everything. I didn't take breaks. I barely drank water. I just walked. My legs burned and my back ached, but I didn't care. The whole way out, I felt watched. The feeling didn't go away. The silence had weight to it now, the kind that pushes on your ears and makes you jump at every twig snapping under your own feet. I didn't hear any animals, not even birds. When I reached the dirt road, I didn't stop. I threw the pack into the trunk, slammed the door, and drove. I didn't even change out of my hiking boots until I hit pavement 2 hours later. Only when I passed through a small town and saw other people, real people walking around casually, did I feel something like relief. Back home, I checked my gear. Everything was there. Nothing damaged, nothing missing. I looked at the photos I took. Still calm, still beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there with me, watching. I didn't report it. What would I say? There were no injuries, no evidence. Just footprints, just breathing, just the silence that followed me back. I still go hiking sometimes, but I don't go that deep anymore. I stick to marked trails. I camp where I can see others, where there are signs of people nearby. I don't search for silence like that anymore, not after hearing what moves inside it. It was early September of 2019 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. I had just turned 32, and the past few months had been full of long workdays, a broken relationship, and too many nights lying awake, thinking too much. I lived in Pittsburgh at the time, and after looking at maps and reading some hiking blogs, I picked a spot about 3 hours away in northern Pennsylvania, just past the Allegheny National Forest, but far from the popular trails. The place wasn't even labeled on most of the hiking forums. It was just a patch of green on an old topographic map I had saved from college, a wide stretch of forest land with no trailheads marked and only one old fire road that curved deep into the trees. I loaded up my old Subaru with basic gear, a new tent I hadn't used yet, a sleeping bag, a bare canister, water filter, food, a portable stove, and 2 knives I kept more out of habit than need. I had an old GPS unit, but I preferred maps. Phones didn't get any service out there, so I turned mine off before I even left the main road. There was something peaceful about being unreachable. The drive was smooth until the last stretch. The paved road turned to gravel, and after that, it was just dirt with overgrown branches scraping the sides of the car. I parked in a clearing off the path where it widened enough to turn around. There was no signage, no other cars, nothing to suggest anyone had been there in a long time. That was what I wanted, complete quiet. I checked my map again, took a compass reading, and hiked north through a narrow animal trail that faded quickly. By early afternoon, I had reached a spot I liked, a soft patch of flat ground near a shallow creek, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sky. I set up my tent, boiled some water for tea, and sat on a mossy rock as the light dropped low. The first night was calm. A few small animals moved through the brush around the tent, but that's normal in woods like these. I listened to them as I lay there in my sleeping bag, half asleep, trying to name what each one might be just by the sound. Chipmunk, squirrel, maybe a raccoon nosing around for food. I'd sealed everything properly, though, and nothing came close. By morning, I felt more rested than I had in weeks. I spent the next day walking upstream, taking pictures of old fallen trees and unusual mushroom growths I saw along the way. The forest was beautiful and untouched. It smelled like pine, wet moss, and decaying leaves, especially where the undergrowth was thick. I didn't see a single person or hear anything man-made. Around midday, I looped back to my campsite, filtered more water, and made a simple meal of pasta and jerky. I wrote in my journal a bit, stretched out by the tent, and soaked in the silence. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like time isn't moving. That second night, something woke me up. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was more like the absence of one. I opened my eyes in total darkness and realized the normal night noises had stopped. No insects, no owls, no wind through the branches. I lay there completely still, listening. For a long time, nothing. Then, from somewhere off to the right, deep in the woods, I heard a branch snap. It wasn't like a squirrel stepping on a twig. It was heavier, slower. A single snap, then silence again. I stayed in my sleeping bag and didn't move. After a minute or so, I heard another noise. Dry leaves shifting under slow footsteps. Something was walking nearby. I reached quietly for the knife I kept near the entrance of my tent and held it under the edge of my sleeping bag. The steps continued, crunching softly. They didn't come closer, but they didn't move away either. Just circled the area, slow and deliberate. I checked my watch by feel. Just past 3 a.m. I stayed completely still, not even blinking, and listened. After maybe 10 minutes, the steps stopped. I waited longer until the normal sounds of the forest returned. First the insects, then distant owl calls. Only then did I let myself breathe normally again. The next morning, I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs anyone had been there. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear, even though it hadn't moved like either. I camped near wildlife before. This had felt different. I debated packing up, but I had planned 3 nights and didn't want to spook myself into leaving. I decided I'd just keep a fire going that night and maybe move my sleeping bag closer to the tent's zipper in case I needed to get out fast. I hiked further east that day to get some distance from camp, trying to shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. There was nothing out there, though, just endless trees and hills. By the time I got back to the tent in the evening, my legs were sore and my stomach was growling. I cooked rice and beans, watched the sun go down through the treetops, and built a small fire with dry wood I'd collected earlier. That night, I kept the fire going as long as I could, feeding it until close to midnight before crawling into the tent. I didn't sleep easily. I kept one ear tuned to every sound outside. Around 2 a.m., the same thing happened, complete silence. Then footsteps again, same spot, same slow circling. But this time they stopped closer. I could hear breathing slow, heavy, like someone who just finished climbing a hill. Then came the softest brushing sound, like a hand on fabric. My tent wall moved, just a little, but enough to let me know something or someone was right there. I held the knife tighter and didn't breathe. The pressure on the tent eased off after a few seconds, and the footsteps retreated slowly into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there, staring at the dark nylon above me, waiting for morning. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside with my knife drawn and walked the perimeter. Again, nothing obvious, but I did find something that hadn't been there before. 3 smooth stones arranged in a triangle just outside the tent flap. They were perfectly aligned, too perfect to be random. I stared at them for a while, then kicked them apart and packed up camp. I didn't care how remote the place was or how beautiful the forest had looked. Someone else was out there, and I didn't want to find out why they were circling my tent in the middle of the night. The hike back to the car felt different. I kept checking over my shoulder. At one point, I saw movement between the trees, quick, low to the ground, but when I stopped and stared, it was gone. I didn't stop again until I reached the fire road and saw the roof of my car through the trees. But when I got to the car, something was off. The driver's side door wasn't fully shut. I always double-check my doors. I keep things locked by habit, especially in remote places. My heart started pounding. I opened the door slowly and looked inside. Nothing looked stolen, but someone had definitely been inside. The seat had been adjusted. It was pushed all the way back like someone taller had sat there. I checked the trunk. All the gear I'd left was still there, but the emergency kit had been opened. The flare was missing. I hadn't touched that kit since I bought the car. I slammed the trunk and got in. As I backed up onto the path and started driving, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again and had phone signal. I pulled over and sat there for 10 minutes, just breathing, hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. I didn't even file a report because what would I say? There were no real signs of a crime, just weirdness. But for weeks afterward, I kept thinking about those nights in the tent, about how someone must have followed me, maybe even watched me set up camp. They'd gotten close enough to touch the tent, to sit in my car. Whoever it was didn't want to hurt me, not directly. They just wanted me to know they were there, that they could get that close without being seen. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike sometimes, and I still love the quiet of the woods, but I stick to marked trails now. I bring people with me. I lock the car twice. I never stay past sunset. That trip changed how I see the wilderness. It's not the animals that make it dangerous. It's what people choose to do when they think no one is watching. And sometimes, in a place so far from everything else, they're right. No one is watching, except for you and them. It was the kind of trip I needed, even if I hadn't realized it before I left. I had been running on empty for months. Long hours at work, a city that felt too crowded and noisy, and a mind that never really shut off. When I finally decided to take a break, I picked a small cabin in the woods about 3 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't a fancy place. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just a simple wooden cabin with a stove, a small kitchen, and enough space to sleep and eat. Exactly what I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows between the tall pine trees. The road leading up was rough, more gravel than anything else, winding through thick forest. The air smelled of pine and earth, fresh but also heavy in a way that city air never was. When I pulled up in front of the cabin, it looked even smaller than I'd imagined, but cozy. The wood was weathered, dark from years of rain and sun, the roof covered in patches of moss. The windows reflected the forest behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt my shoulders drop a little, as if the tension I'd been carrying was starting to melt. Inside, the cabin was quiet except for the faint creak of the old wooden floor and the soft whistle of wind through the cracks in the walls. The small kitchen had a worn counter, an old gas stove, and a sink with running water, thankfully. There was a table with 2 chairs and a couch with cushions that looked like they had seen better days. I set my bag down and opened a window to let in the cool evening air. Outside, the trees rustled gently, and birds chirped their last songs of the day. I unpacked some food, a loaf of bread, cheese, some canned beans, and a small bottle of whiskey I'd brought to keep company. I didn't want to overdo it, just enough to calm the nerves that always buzzed when I was alone in a new place. I lit the stove and made a simple meal, the warmth from the flame a comfort against the creeping chill that was already settling into the cabin. The walls were thin, and I could hear every small sound the forest made, the snap of a twig, the flutter of wings, the distant call of an owl. As darkness deepened outside, I lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting soft shadows on the walls. I sat at the table with my food, savoring the silence, the lack of distractions. It was peaceful in a way the city never was, but it was also strange, unfamiliar. I kept thinking I could hear something just beyond the window, a soft rustling, a faint scratching sound. But every time I looked, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I was alone in the woods, surrounded by wildlife. It was normal for animals to move around at night. I told myself to focus on the good parts, the quiet, the air, the chance to clear my mind. But when I finished eating and cleaned up, the cabin suddenly felt colder. Not the temperature outside, but something else. The kind of cold that settles into your bones. I put on an old sweater and wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch. The whiskey helped a bit, but it also made my thoughts louder. I found myself listening more closely to the sounds around me. The wind had picked up, and the trees were now creaking, their branches knocking against each other like dry bones. Somewhere close by, something was scratching at the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but persistent, like an animal trying to get in. I got up and went to the window, peering into the blackness outside. The beam from my flashlight cut through the night, catching a glimpse of movement near the porch. A raccoon? Maybe a stray dog? Whatever it was, it disappeared quickly into the woods. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my pounding heart. The night stretched on. I found it hard to sleep. Every noise seemed louder than it should have been. The wind, the rustling leaves, even the occasional distant howl of a coyote made my skin crawl. I kept checking the locks on the doors and windows, even though I knew they were sturdy. The cabin was miles from any road, and no one was supposed to be near. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, the sun filtered through the trees in warm golden rays. I stepped outside, hoping the daylight would make me feel better. The forest was quiet, peaceful even. Birds flitted through the branches, and the air smelled fresh, almost sweet. I took a deep breath and started walking along a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The trail was overgrown in places, but still clear enough to follow. Pine needles cushioned my steps, and the soft ground was damp from the previous night's dew. I noticed signs of animals, tracks in the mud, broken branches, and scattered pine cones. It was beautiful, untouched, and wild. But the deeper I walked, the more I felt that same uneasy tension from the night before creeping back. I wasn't alone. I caught glimpses out of the corner of my eye, something moving just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was deer or some other harmless animal, but it didn't feel right. The movements were too deliberate, too quiet. I stopped several times, shining my flashlight or looking carefully, but saw nothing solid, just shadows that seemed to dart away whenever I looked directly. I went back to the cabin by late afternoon, the unease settling deeper with every step. I double-checked the perimeter, looking for anything unusual. That's when I saw it. A small pile of broken branches and leaves just outside the back door, arranged in a rough circle, like someone had been there recently. My stomach tightened. I couldn't tell if it was an animal's work or a human's. That night, I tried to stay calm. I moved the furniture closer to the windows, blocking any easy access. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I kept the stove burning low for light and warmth. I had my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. The scratching came again, louder this time, around midnight. It wasn't just at the door anymore. It sounded like someone, or something, was circling the cabin, trying to find a way in. My heart pounded, and I stayed as still as possible, listening. Suddenly, a heavy thud hit the side of the cabin. I jumped, my breath catching. Then another, and another. It was deliberate, like someone was hitting the wall with a heavy object. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but I knew I had to act. I grabbed a heavy metal lamp from the table and waited. The thudding stopped. I stayed quiet, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that, sitting by the window, watching the forest for any sign of movement. Morning brought relief. The sun was strong, and the forest looked safe again. I decided I wouldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, keeping an eye on the woods the entire time. As I started the car and pulled away from the cabin, I glanced back once more. The trees seemed to swallow the small wooden building whole. The uneasy feeling lingered, but it was behind me now. That trip wasn't the peaceful retreat I had hoped for, but it taught me something important about silence, solitude, and the kind of fear that doesn't come from monsters or stories. It comes from knowing how small and alone you really are when everything familiar disappears. And sometimes, that's enough to make a night in the woods feel like the longest night of your life. The sun was just starting to dip behind the thick pines when I pulled off the narrow gravel road onto the dirt path that led to the cabin. It had been years since I'd been back here, and the place looked smaller than I remembered, almost swallowed by the forest that had grown around it. The paint on the cabin's wooden walls was faded and chipped, peeling like dried bark. The windows were dark, dusty, and cracked in a few places. The porch creaked beneath my boots as I stepped down, and I could smell the damp earth mixed with the faint scent of pine needles and old wood. I'd come here for a few days of quiet, a break from the endless noise of the city. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who had passed away a year ago. He had left it to me in his will. It was the kind of place that didn't see many visitors, tucked away at the edge of a dense forest where cell signal disappeared and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I'd grown up visiting here in summers, but it had been nearly a decade since my last trip. The isolation felt strange now, like stepping into another world. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no hum of cars or voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and dust, with a faint trace of smoke from the last fire my uncle had built months ago. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, and the warm glow filled the small living room. The wooden floorboards groaned under my footsteps as I moved from room to room, running my hand over the rough wooden table, the threadbare couch, the old photographs hanging crookedly on the walls. I found a stack of books on a shelf, mostly about local wildlife and survival skills. The radio sat on a counter, coated in dust, its dial frozen on an old country station. I tried to settle in, unpacking a few things, making a simple meal on the small stove. Outside, the forest pressed close, darkening quickly as the night deepened. I noticed how the windows rattled softly with the wind and how the shadows flickered in the corners of the room from the firelight. The silence pressed in on me, thick and heavy. I fell asleep that night to the sounds of twigs snapping and leaves crunching somewhere outside, not far from the cabin. The next morning, I woke early, the sun filtering through the grimy windows. The air was cooler than I expected for late summer, damp and fresh. I stepped outside onto the porch, the wooden boards slick with morning dew. The forest stretched endlessly around me, tall trees standing like silent sentinels. The dirt path that led back to the road was overgrown with weeds and small saplings. I grabbed a rusty axe from the side of the cabin and started clearing some of the underbrush near the porch, trying to make the place feel less forgotten. As I worked, I heard the faint sound of running water somewhere to the east. I remembered a small creek my uncle used to talk about, not far from the cabin. After clearing some space, I decided to explore and find it. The forest was thick, with fallen branches and dense bushes. The ground was soft underfoot, scattered with pine needles and moss. I moved carefully, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. The sun was bright overhead, but the trees blocked much of the light, casting long shadows on the ground. After a while, I found the creek, a narrow, clear stream winding between smooth stones and fallen logs. The water was cold and fresh, bubbling softly over the rocks. I knelt down and cupped my hands, drinking the water and feeling a sense of calm. Around the creek, the forest was alive with birds and insects. The quiet was different here, not as heavy as near the cabin. I spent the afternoon walking along the creek, following it as it curved deeper into the forest. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The forest floor was darker here, covered with thick moss and fallen leaves. Occasionally, I spotted animal tracks in the mud, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. As the sun began to drop, I headed back toward the cabin, feeling the chill start to settle in the air. The forest seemed to shift around me. Shadows lengthened and moved in strange ways, and the sound of the creek faded behind me. When I reached the cabin, the light was fading fast. I lit the fire again and cooked a simple meal, the warmth and light comforting against the creeping darkness. That night, I barely slept. Every small noise startled me. Branches scraping the windows, an animal's distant call, the occasional snap of a twig just outside. The cabin, so familiar in daylight, felt foreign and vulnerable in the dark. I kept the fire burning as long as I could, but eventually the wood ran low, and I had to let the flames die out. The cold crept in, and I wrapped myself in a blanket, listening to the night sounds. The next day was overcast, a gray sky pressing down on the forest. I spent the morning cleaning the cabin, opening windows to air out the musty smell. The wind picked up, shaking the trees and rattling the old wooden shutters. I noticed the floorboards had begun to warp and buckle in places, and the roof leaked in a few spots where the shingles were missing. It was clear the cabin needed repairs if it was going to last much longer. I decided to check the generator out back. It was old and rusted, but my uncle had left a note with some instructions. After some fiddling, I got it running. The cabin hummed with a low mechanical sound, and I plugged in a few lights and my phone charger. The signal was weak, but it was enough to check the weather and send a quick message to my sister. That afternoon, I went back toward the road, hoping to get a better cell signal. The path was slippery from last night's rain, and the mud sucked at my boots. The forest felt different today, colder somehow, like it was holding its breath. As I climbed the hill that overlooked the valley, I spotted a shape moving between the trees below. A deer or maybe a large dog. It stopped and looked up, its eyes catching the fading light. Then it vanished back into the shadows. I reached the road and stood there for a while, watching the empty stretch of asphalt disappear into the horizon. No cars passed. No people appeared. The silence was absolute. I realized how cut off this place really was. The thought was both peaceful and unnerving. Back at the cabin, the evening grew darker and colder. I sat by the fire again, reading one of the old survival books. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak. I could hear the animals moving in the forest, the occasional howl of a coyote, the rustle of something big moving through the brush. The night stretched on endlessly, the shadows growing longer and more restless. On the third day, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was more deliberate. A slow, steady scratching at the side of the cabin. I got up and pulled on my boots, stepping outside into the cool morning air. The sun was just rising, casting pale light over the forest. I walked around the cabin, trying to find the source of the noise. At the back, near the woodpile, I found deep scratch marks gouged into the wooden siding. The bark was stripped away in places, and there were bits of fur caught in the splinters. My heart jumped. Whatever had done this was big and strong. I scanned the trees around the cabin. The forest was quiet now, no rustling or movement. I felt exposed and vulnerable in a way I hadn't before. The animals here weren't like the ones back home, and some of them could be dangerous. That day, I stayed mostly inside, keeping the fire going and barricading the windows with old boards I found in the shed. I double-checked the locks on the doors, even though I knew they wouldn't keep out a determined animal or person. The scratches outside gnawed at my nerves. I tried to convince myself it was a bear or a large dog looking for food, but the marks were too deep and deliberate to be random. The nights got worse after that. Every sound outside seemed louder, closer. I would lie awake, listening to the forest breathing around me. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of movement just beyond the window's edge, shadows flickering between trees, eyes shining faintly in the dark. I didn't dare go outside after sunset anymore. On the fourth day, the weather turned cold and rainy. The wind drove sheets of rain against the cabin walls. The forest soaked through the mud and leaves, the creek swelling with runoff. I stayed inside, watching the rain blur the world outside. The isolation felt complete, a pressure building in the silence. Late that afternoon, as the storm raged, I heard a loud crash. It came from the woods behind the cabin, followed by a heavy thud and the sound of branches breaking. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, the rain stinging my face. I shone the light into the trees, but the storm made visibility almost zero. I caught glimpses of something large moving through the underbrush, but it disappeared quickly. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the rain and wind. There was no answer. I returned inside, shaking. The cabin felt smaller, more fragile. I barricaded the door again and sat close to the fire, trying to calm down. The sun was just starting to sink behind the tall pines when I pulled off the gravel road and onto the narrow dirt path leading to the cabin. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. Just me, the woods, and a chance to get away from the constant noise of the city. The cabin was something I had rented through a small website, an old wooden structure tucked away in a remote part of northern Vermont. It was isolated, the perfect place to clear my head and maybe find a little peace. I hadn't been there before. No cell service for miles, no neighbors, no distractions. The trees towered over the narrow path as I drove slowly, my headlights cutting through the early evening shadows. I spotted a small clearing up ahead, where the cabin sat, more weathered than I'd expected but still solid. The paint was peeling on the window frames, and the roof had patches where the shingles were missing, but it had character. A thin layer of moss covered parts of the roof, and the wooden porch looked a little warped, but nothing that worried me. The air smelled like damp wood and pine needles, fresh and clean compared to the smog of the city. I parked the car next to the porch and grabbed my bag, feeling the cool air settle around me as I locked the door. The quiet was immediate and heavy. No cars, no voices, just the faint rustling of leaves stirred by a light breeze. I stood there for a moment, just breathing it in, feeling how much slower the world seemed out here. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and earth. Dust motes floated in the beams of light from my flashlight. The place was simple, a small living area with a worn sofa, a wood stove, a kitchen with some basic appliances, and a narrow hallway leading to a couple of bedrooms. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I moved through the space. It had the kind of quiet that felt like it could swallow you whole, not the peaceful kind, but the empty kind. I set my bag down and started unpacking, making a small fire in the stove to take the edge off the chill settling in the room. The logs crackled as they caught flame, and the warmth spread slowly, chasing away the damp cold. Outside, the sky darkened, and the stars began to appear, sharp, clear points of light that felt so much closer than in the city. That night, I slept with the window cracked open, letting in the crisp air and the sounds of the woods. I wasn't sure if it was the unfamiliar noises or just the quiet pressing in on me, but I woke up a few times hearing twigs snapping, something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal passing by. The forest was full of them, but the sounds unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I woke early. The fire mostly burned out, but the cabin still warm. I made coffee on the small stove and sat by the window, watching the forest light up with the morning sun. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. I planned to spend the day hiking, exploring the trails marked on the map I had brought. It wasn't far, maybe a few miles into the forest, and the promise of solitude and nature was exactly what I needed. As I packed my small backpack with water, snacks, and a map, I noticed the sun had started to break through the thick canopy outside, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The trailhead was a short walk from the cabin, just past a small stream. I followed the path carefully, the dirt soft underfoot, covered with pine needles and fallen leaves. The woods were alive with sounds: birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of small animals moving in the underbrush. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became, the tall trees blocking the wind and muffling distant sounds. I found a small clearing halfway through the hike, with a shallow pond reflecting the sky like a mirror. I stopped there for a while, just watching the water ripple in the gentle breeze. The peacefulness felt good, but as I moved on, I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. Footprints in the mud that didn't match mine, too large for any deer or small animal. Broken branches snapped off at strange angles, like something had been pushing through the brush. And then there were the sounds, faint but definitely not animal noises. Heavy breathing, distant footsteps following the trail, always just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe other hikers or someone else camping nearby. The area was remote, but not unvisited. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I kept my eyes peeled and stayed on the path, trying to stay calm. As I got closer to the cabin, the sun was dipping low again, and the shadows were long and thick. I quickened my pace, the unease growing heavier in my chest. When I reached the clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks on the dirt road leading away from the cabin, too new to have been there when I arrived. The car was still parked, but the tracks suggested someone had come or gone recently. I looked around, heart pounding, but there was no sign of anyone. Back inside the cabin, I checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked tight. I found the old landline phone sitting on a dusty table.
No di alto un.
Not surprising out here, but it added to the isolation. I tried my cell phone again, hoping for a signal. Nothing. That night, the woods felt different. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the trees. The noises outside were louder, branches snapping, leaves crunching, footsteps pacing just beyond the clearing. I kept the fire going strong, the warmth a small comfort against the growing cold outside. The shadows seemed to press against the windows, dark shapes moving just beyond the edge of the light. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. The air felt thick with something unspoken, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up quickly, glancing outside at the gray sky and the restless woods. The car started on the first try, and I drove off the dirt road back toward the main gravel road, eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The silence outside the car was overwhelming, but inside I felt a strange sense of relief. As I drove back toward civilization, I kept replaying the night's sounds in my mind. What had been out there? Why had I felt so watched? The answers didn't come, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back to that cabin anytime soon. The weekend had been exactly what I needed in some ways. A break from the city, a taste of solitude. But the forest held its own secrets, and I had no desire to uncover them again. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the trees, stayed with me long after I left. It was a reminder that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, the unknown was always there, waiting. When I finally got back to my apartment, the city noises felt loud and overwhelming, but also safe. The strange isolation of the cabin in the woods, the endless dark, and the unsettling presence had been left behind. I shut the door and locked it, feeling the walls close around me in a way that was comforting, not confining. That weekend taught me something important. There's a difference between being alone and being truly isolated. And some places, no matter how beautiful or peaceful they seem, hold a weight that presses down on you. A kind of quiet danger you can't see but can feel deep in your bones. I'm grateful to be back, grounded in the real world, where even the darkest shadows have light to chase them away. But sometimes, when the city is too loud or too bright, I think about that cabin, the forest, and the silence. And I remember the feeling of being watched, the shadows just out of reach, and the cold truth that some places are meant to stay empty. The summer air was heavy when I arrived at the cabin, nestled deep in the woods, far from any road or town. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden cabin that looked weathered but solid enough. The paint was peeling, the windows dusty, and the porch sagged slightly on one side. I had rented it for a week, hoping for some quiet time away from the noise of the city and my usual life. The forest stretched thick all around, tall trees shading the ground even in the afternoon sun, with patches of moss and fallen leaves covering the earth like a green-brown carpet. There was no cell signal, no internet, nothing but the silence and the occasional bird or rustling leaf, the kind of silence that feels alive, as if the forest itself is watching. I parked my car on a narrow dirt track that ended at the cabin and grabbed my backpack. The weight of it, full of food, water, books, and some basic supplies, reminded me I wasn't here for comfort but for solitude. As I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked under my boots. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning a low protest. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly sour, maybe dampness trapped from winter's cold. The room was small, with a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a stove, and a bed with a thin mattress. A small window faced the forest, letting in slants of fading sunlight. The first thing I did was unpack and arrange my things. I stacked some firewood next to the stove, tested the matches in my pocket, and then set out to explore the surroundings. The forest was dense, filled with tall pines and oaks, the ground soft underfoot. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. As I walked, I noticed the way the light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows that shifted with the breeze. The quiet was so complete it almost hurt. Even the usual sounds of distant traffic or planes were gone, just the forest breathing around me. That evening, I built a small fire outside the cabin. The dry wood snapped and popped, sending up sparks that floated upward like tiny stars. The sky turned dark, showing a scattering of real stars, clear and sharp without city lights to blur them. I sat near the fire, the heat warming my face, feeling calm for the first time in months. The silence felt like a blanket, comforting rather than empty. As the fire died down, I went inside, locked the door, and got ready for bed. The first night passed quietly except for the usual forest sounds. Owl calls, the rustling of small animals, the occasional creak of branches. But on the second night, things started to feel different. I woke up sometime around 2 a.m., a faint noise pulling me from sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate crunching sound outside the cabin, like footsteps on dry leaves or twigs. I froze, listening. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I strained my eyes in the dark, staring at the window, but saw nothing. No flashlight, no movement, just black. I told myself it was probably a deer or some small animal, but the way the steps moved slowly, deliberately, made my stomach tighten. I reached over and turned on my phone's flashlight, shining it toward the window. The beam caught nothing but the empty forest floor and the shadows of trees. I held my breath for a few minutes, but when nothing happened, I put the light away and tried to sleep again. Still, the feeling lingered, like someone was out there watching the cabin. The next day, I told myself to stay busy. I chopped some more wood, collected water from the nearby stream, and cleaned the cabin a little. The sun was strong, the air warm, and the forest seemed peaceful in the daylight. But when the sun began to set and the shadows grew long, I noticed small things that unsettled me. My firewood pile had been disturbed. One log was moved slightly, as if someone had touched it. I knew I hadn't done it. I double-checked the cabin door and windows. All were locked and intact. Maybe a raccoon or some animal had rummaged through. Still, when night came again, I was more alert. I didn't want to show fear, but I felt vulnerable. I sat inside with the curtains drawn, my small flashlight close at hand. After a while, I noticed a faint light flickering outside, near the edge of the trees. It wasn't firelight like mine, but something smaller, like a handheld light, maybe a flashlight. The glow was weak and brief, appearing and disappearing among the trunks. I held my breath, watching. Then it vanished. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I considered leaving, but something kept me there. I told myself I had come for peace, for a break from everything. Maybe it was just my imagination, or some local hunters passing by. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I realized the forest that seemed so welcoming by day was something else at night. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their long shadows hiding eyes that might be watching. I decided to explore a little further during the afternoon, hoping to find a clearer trail or maybe a nearby cabin or road. I packed my day bag with water, a knife, a map, and some snacks. The woods became thicker as I walked, the path narrow and covered in fallen branches. I noticed old tire tracks in the dirt, faint but recent. Someone had been here before me. After walking for almost 2 hours, I found an old, abandoned hunting stand-up in a tree. The wood was rotten, the ladder broken halfway. It was a good vantage point, so I climbed carefully onto a lower branch and looked around. The forest stretched endlessly, but in the distance, I thought I could see the flicker of another small light. It was far away, but definitely there. I decided to head back quickly. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, and I didn't want to get caught in the forest after dark. As I hurried down the trail, I heard a twig snap behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, and spun around. Nothing, just the trees and fading light. But the hair on the back of my neck stood up. When I reached the cabin, I bolted the door and double-checked the locks. The firewood pile was disturbed again. This time 2 logs had been shifted. I knew for sure it wasn't an animal. Animals don't leave patterns or signals like that. It felt like someone was marking their presence, watching me. I spent that night sitting by the stove, the cabin dark except for the weak light of my flashlight. Outside, I could hear faint movements, something scraping against the side of the cabin. I grabbed my knife and opened the door a crack to see what it was. The cool night air smelled of pine and wet earth. Nothing but the trees swaying in the wind. Then I spotted footprints in the soft dirt by the porch, boot prints, fresh and leading away into the woods. Fear crept into my chest. Whoever was out there was close, maybe watching me right now. I couldn't call anyone, no phone signal, no radio. I thought about trying to hike out in the dark, but that felt even more dangerous. Instead, I did what I could. I moved all the firewood inside, blocking the door as best I could. I found a heavy metal bar by the stove and kept it near. I made sure every window was shut tight. Then I sat in the middle of the room, watching shadows on the walls, waiting for the sun. The night felt endless. Every noise outside made me jump. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, distant animal cries. At one point, I heard something heavy moving close by the cabin, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might give me away. I stayed awake until the first light crept through the window. When the forest brightened, the sounds stopped. The silence returned. I spent the next morning checking the perimeter of the cabin. I found more footprints, some older, some fresh, around the cabin and in the nearby woods. Someone had been watching me for days, maybe longer. I knew this wasn't just some random camper or hunter passing by. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, my knife, the metal bar, and a flashlight, and planned my escape. I waited until mid-morning, when the sun was high and the forest was bright, hoping that daylight would give me cover. I followed the faint tire tracks I'd seen before, walking quickly but quietly. The forest was thick, and the trail twisted in confusing loops. After an hour, I heard voices in the distance, muffled and low, but no clear words. I didn't stop to listen. I kept going. Eventually, the forest began to thin, and I reached a gravel road. Relief washed over me like a wave. I followed the road downhill, and after about 30 minutes, I saw a small farmhouse with a couple of cars parked outside. I walked up to the door and knocked. An older man answered, surprised to see me. I explained I had been staying in the woods at the cabin and felt unsafe because someone had been watching me. The man listened quietly, then told me the area had some problems with illegal hunters and trespassers. He offered to call the local sheriff. Later that day, the sheriff came by the cabin with a couple of deputies. They searched the area and found some hidden campsites and discarded weapons nearby. The footprints I had seen matched those of known trespassers who had been causing trouble in the forest. The first thing that struck me about the cabin was how isolated it was. Nestled deep in the forest, miles away from any town or main road, it was the kind of place I had always imagined visiting during one of my rare breaks from work. No neighbors for miles, no sounds of traffic, just the dense silence of trees and the occasional bird call. The cabin stood on a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. Its wooden frame was weathered but sturdy, the paint peeling off in places. A narrow dirt path, barely visible beneath fallen leaves, led to the front door. I had arrived just before sunset, carrying my bags and a small cooler filled with food and water. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and something earthy, like the scent of damp soil mixed with dry leaves. The floor creaked softly as I moved across the room. A small kitchen area was set against one wall, with a wood-burning stove and a sink with cold water. A dining table made of rough pine sat near the window, and beyond it was a small living area with a couch and a worn-out armchair. The bedroom was separated by a simple door, and the bathroom was tiny but functional. The windows were dirty but let in enough light to see everything clearly. I had planned this trip to escape the noise of the city and the endless work emails. I wanted to spend a few days alone, without distractions, reading, writing, and hiking the nearby trails. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, filled with thick undergrowth and tall trees. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves and the faint sound of a creek somewhere in the distance. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire in the stove, made a simple dinner of canned beans and rice, and read a book by the flickering light. Outside, the darkness was complete, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning bugs. The silence was deep but not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. The next day, I set out to explore the area. The forest trails were narrow and winding, covered in a thick carpet of pine needles and dry leaves. Birds flitted through the trees, and I saw small animals like squirrels and rabbits darting away at my approach. The air smelled fresh and piney, and the sun filtered down through the branches, creating patches of light on the forest floor. I walked for hours, following the sound of the creek until I found a small clearing with a rocky stream. The water was clear and cold, and I filled my water bottle from it, careful to use my filter. After resting there for a while, I headed back to the cabin, feeling peaceful and satisfied with the day's walk. That night, I prepared more firewood and stacked it carefully near the stove. I noticed that the wind had picked up outside, making the trees sway and creak. The sound was soothing at first but grew louder as the evening went on. I closed the windows tightly and settled in with a book. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sudden noise outside, something heavy crashing against the side of the cabin. My heart jumped. I sat up quickly, listening intently. The wind was howling now, and the trees groaned under the force of it. The noise came again, a dull thud, followed by the sound of branches snapping. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door cautiously, peering out into the night. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the side of the cabin and the nearby trees. On the ground, I saw a large branch that had been broken off and fallen. The wind must have knocked it down. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and closed the door. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I found it hard to sleep. The storm continued, the wind shaking the cabin and rain tapping against the roof. The following morning, I went outside to assess the damage. The broken branch lay on the ground, soaked and heavy. Other than that, the cabin seemed intact. The forest looked different under the gray sky, the colors muted and the air thick with moisture. I decided to spend the day inside, reading and writing, waiting for the storm to pass. Later in the afternoon, the weather cleared, and I stepped outside again. As I walked along the path toward the creek, I noticed something odd, fresh footprints in the mud. They were large and deep, definitely not mine. The pattern was unfamiliar, wider than a normal shoe print, with long toes or claws visible in the soft earth. My mind raced. Could it be an animal? Maybe a bear or a large wildcat? But the prints seemed strange, almost human-like but bigger. I followed the trail carefully, my eyes scanning the forest floor. The prints led toward the creek but then disappeared near a thicket of bushes. I felt a chill run down my spine. The forest was wild and unpredictable, but I had never encountered anything like this before. I decided not to tell anyone until I had more information. Maybe I was just imagining things. That evening, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows and kept the fire burning. I ate dinner quietly, listening to the occasional call of an owl. The forest was alive with sounds at night, but they felt distant and natural. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. On the third day, I planned a longer hike, hoping to find more of the forest trails I had seen on the map. I packed my backpack with water, snacks, and a compass, then set off early. The air was crisp, and the sun was bright as I walked deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller and the underbrush thicker. I climbed over fallen logs and stepped carefully around roots and rocks. After a few hours, I reached a ridge with a view over the valley below. The sight was breathtaking, endless forest stretching out in every direction, the sun casting golden light over the treetops. I took a break, eating some trail mix and drinking water. As I prepared to head back, I noticed something odd again. Another set of footprints, this time fresh and nearby. They were the same strange prints I had seen earlier, heading in the opposite direction from mine. My heart quickened. I looked around, trying to see if anyone or anything was nearby, but the forest was quiet except for the birds. I decided not to follow the prints. Instead, I hurried back toward the cabin, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. When I arrived, I locked the door behind me and checked all the windows again. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was probably just a large animal or even another hiker who had passed by. That night, sleep was even harder to find. Every little sound made me tense up. I kept the flashlight on the bedside table and a knife close by, just in case. The wind was still blowing outside, but the storm had passed. On the fourth day, I woke early and decided to check the perimeter of the cabin carefully. I wanted to see if there was any sign of who or what had left those prints. As I walked around, I noticed other signs: broken branches, disturbed leaves, and small scratches on the bark of a tree near the back door. The scratches were long and deep, as if made by claws. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. This was no ordinary animal. The forest felt less welcoming, and the silence heavier. I spent the rest of the day inside, reading old maps and researching wildlife in the area on my phone while the battery lasted. I found that bears and mountain lions were common in the region, but the claw marks and footprints didn't match any typical animal exactly. That evening, I decided to set up a makeshift alarm system around the cabin. I tied thin ropes between trees with cans attached so that if anything moved through the clearing, the cans would rattle and alert me. I also cleared some brush near the cabin to improve visibility. The next night, I was prepared. I kept the fire going and stayed alert. Around midnight, the cans started rattling softly. My heart jumped as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I shone the light toward the edge of the clearing and saw movement, dark shapes moving just beyond the tree line. I stayed calm, shining the light steadily. The shapes stopped and retreated slowly into the forest. The cans kept rattling for a few moments before silence returned. I realized then that something was definitely out there, watching and waiting, but it wasn't trying to attack yet. It was cautious. The following days passed with little incident, though I remained on edge. I didn't venture far from the cabin and kept the alarm system in place. The footprints and scratches continued to appear around the cabin, but nothing more. On the last day of my trip, I woke early and packed my things. As I prepared to leave, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The forest had tested me, made me feel small and vulnerable, but it had also shown me beauty and quiet strength. I locked the cabin door behind me and started down the trail toward the main road. The sun was rising, casting long shadows and filling the sky with pink and orange light. I didn't look back. Later, safe in my car and on my way home, I thought about the strange signs in the forest. Whatever had been there was wild and real, part of the untamed world beyond civilization. It hadn't harmed me, but it had reminded me to respect the forest's silence and mysteries. That trip changed how I saw nature, not as a peaceful escape, but as a living, breathing place full of hidden dangers and quiet watchers. And sometimes the forest was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, a steady, soft murmur that seemed to stretch on endlessly. I had driven for hours down a narrow dirt road, the kind you don't find on most maps, the kind with branches scraping against the sides of the car and potholes big enough to jolt you awake if you weren't paying attention. I was alone, except for the luggage in the trunk and a backpack slung over my shoulder, filled with nothing more than the basics for a weekend in the woods. This cabin was supposed to be a break, a place to escape the noise and the stress of the city, a place where I could just be quiet and breathe. But as I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood, the sinking feeling in my chest told me this would not be the easy weekend I had hoped for. The cabin was old but solid, made of rough-hewn logs darkened by years of rain and sun. It sat just off the edge of a small clearing, the tall pines and spruces surrounding it thick and unyielding. There was no electricity, no running water, just the cabin and the forest around it. I had read the description carefully before booking. Rustic retreat, perfect for disconnecting. I guess I was prepared for rustic. The wooden door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing inside the empty space. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light that slipped through the grimy windows. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp wood and something older, like the smell of things that have been left untouched for years. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots as I explored the small main room. A stone fireplace took up one wall, its hearth filled with cold ashes. Against another wall was a rough table and two chairs, their surfaces scratched and worn. The kitchen area was little more than a corner with a sink that had no water and a small wood stove, blackened with soot. A narrow staircase led up to a loft that served as the bedroom, where a mattress lay in the center, bare except for a threadbare blanket. I dropped my bag and went outside, taking in the cold air and the vastness of the forest. The sky was clear, stars already beginning to peek through the darkening blue. I made a quick plan: gather firewood, get the stove going for some heat, and then settle in with the small stock of food I had brought. The wind whispered through the branches, and though it was calming in some ways, it also carried a strange weight, like something waiting just beyond sight. I spent the next hour splitting logs with the old axe I found in the shed behind the cabin. My arms ached from the effort, but the sharp crack of the wood breaking apart was satisfying. I piled the wood by the stove, then struck matches to light the fire. The first few tries failed, the damp wood reluctant to catch, but finally, the flames took hold. Warmth spread through the room, softening the edges of the cold and shadow. I sat close to the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, their orange light throwing long, shifting shadows on the walls. As night deepened, the sounds outside grew louder. The wind rustled more insistently through the trees, and somewhere not too far away, I heard the occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of underbrush. I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons moving through the forest. Still, there was something about the noise that didn't feel right. It was too steady, too deliberate, like someone or something was moving carefully and watching. I tried to focus on reading, but the words blurred on the page. My mind kept drifting back to the sounds outside, to the shadows in the corners of the cabin. I checked the windows. No sign of anything unusual, just the trees swaying in the night. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was imagining things. Later, the fire burned low, and I climbed the stairs to the loft. The mattress creaked beneath me, the blanket rough against my skin. The silence up here was different, thicker somehow, and I found it harder to breathe. The only light came from the moon through the small window, casting pale shapes on the wall. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard it, a soft scrape against the cabin wall. Not once, but again, slow and measured. I froze, every nerve in my body alert. It wasn't the wind. It was something moving outside, just beyond the window. My heart pounded, loud enough to fill the room. I strained my eyes but could see nothing but dark shapes and leaves. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was running a hand or a tool along the wood. I wanted to tell myself it was just an animal, but the sound was wrong. Too steady, too precise. It stopped after a minute, and the silence returned, thick and heavy. I lay there for hours, eyes open, listening to the forest breathing around me. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a fitful sleep. Morning came cold and gray, the light muted through thick clouds. I didn't want to stay another night, but the nearest town was miles away, and the roads could be bad after rain. I packed up quickly, checked the cabin one last time, and stepped outside. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, but the unease lingered. As I walked toward my car, I noticed something strange on the ground near the cabin. A series of footprints pressed into the soft earth. They were fresh and led away from the cabin into the trees, but they weren't animal prints. They were human. The shapes were clear, the outline of boots deep and deliberate. I crouched to look closer, my stomach twisting. Whoever had been here last night had been watching, waiting. I didn't stop to investigate. I walked fast, my breath visible in the cold air, ears tuned to every sound. When I reached the road, I didn't slow down until the lights of the town appeared ahead. I locked the doors tight, started the engine, and didn't look back. That weekend at the cabin was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it left me with a quiet, persistent fear that sometimes the wilderness holds things you can't see. Things that watch you in the dark and move silently just beyond your sight. I never went back, and I never will. Started as a simple plan, just a weekend getaway to clear my head. I had been working nonstop for months, the kind of job that makes you forget what fresh air feels like. So when the opportunity came up to rent a cabin far from the city, surrounded by trees and silence, I took it without hesitation. I needed a break from screens, emails, and endless noise. I needed to be alone, and the cabin seemed perfect. The cabin was small but sturdy, built decades ago by someone who clearly knew how to work with wood and stone. It sat deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The address was just coordinates on a map, no street signs or paved roads nearby. To get there, I drove down a gravel road that twisted through thick pine forests. The sun was setting by the time I arrived, and the tall trees cast long shadows across the dirt path. Pulling my car up to the cabin, I noticed it was in better shape than I expected. The wood on the outside was weathered but well cared for. The front porch was rough but solid, with a couple of rocking chairs covered in a thin layer of dust. The windows were large, framed with old glass that caught the last rays of light. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and something faintly musty, like old books or damp earth. The main room was cozy, with a stone fireplace, a heavy wooden table, and a few chairs scattered around. A small kitchen was tucked into one corner, with basic appliances and shelves lined with canned food and spices. The bedroom was just off the main room, with a single bed and a small dresser. There was no electricity except for a single overhead light powered by a generator the owner mentioned in the rental instructions. I unpacked my bag, laid out some simple food, and built a fire in the fireplace. The crackling sound was comforting, a reminder I was somewhere quiet, far from everything. Outside, the woods were thick and dark, the only light coming from a sliver of moon barely peeking through the branches. That first night was calm. I slept deeply, waking only once when the wind pushed against the cabin walls. But the next day was different. I woke early and made coffee on a small gas stove. The cabin felt warm and still, the silence almost too complete. No birds, no rustling animals, just a deep, thick quiet that filled every corner. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading into the forest, worn down by years of footsteps but overgrown in parts. As I walked, I noticed how the trees seemed to close in tighter. Their branches knotted together above so little sunlight could reach the forest floor. The air was cooler and damp, filled with the smell of pine needles and wet soil. After a while, I came across an old logging road, barely visible through the brush. It seemed abandoned, with tree stumps scattered and moss covering the cracked ground. The silence here was even more profound, and I felt a strange weight in my chest, a kind of pressure that made me want to hurry back. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon reading and preparing food. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. The forest came alive with sounds: cracking branches, distant animal calls, and the rustling of leaves. I sat by the fire, trying to ignore the nervous feeling creeping up my spine. That night, I heard something outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The sounds were soft but persistent, a shuffling that circled the cabin. I stayed quiet, listening, trying to make sense of the noises. They moved slowly, stopping and starting, as if something was pacing just beyond the tree line. I thought about stepping outside, but the darkness felt too thick, too close. Instead, I kept the fire burning, grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and waited. The noises eventually faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the forest. The next morning, I found footprints around the cabin, large, heavy prints in the damp soil. They looked like they belonged to a person, but something about them was off. The prints were deep, as if whoever had made them weighed a lot. They circled the cabin twice, stopping near the back door before heading off into the trees. I felt uneasy but told myself it was probably a hunter or a neighbor checking the area. Still, I made sure to lock the doors and windows before leaving the cabin to explore again. This time, I went further down the logging road. The forest grew darker and the air heavier as I walked. I found old pieces of equipment, rusted chains, broken tools, and a collapsed wooden structure covered in vines. It looked like part of a logging camp abandoned years ago. The place had a strange feeling. It was silent but felt watched. My skin prickled, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. I stayed on the path and didn't stray into the deeper woods. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was low, and shadows stretched long across the clearing. I started a fire again and ate a simple dinner, trying to calm my nerves. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the cabin windows. Later that night, I was jolted awake by a loud bang on the cabin wall. It sounded like a heavy object hitting the wood. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and shone it outside. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing. No animals, no people, just empty trees swaying in the wind. The banging came again, this time on the back door. I shone the light there, waiting, breathing hard. The noise stopped. For a long time, I sat frozen, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. Sleep came in short bursts after that. Every little noise made me jump. The isolation suddenly felt dangerous, the peaceful woods turning hostile. On the third day, I decided to leave early. I packed my things quickly, eager to get back to civilization. Before I left, I walked around the cabin one last time, checking the perimeter. That's when I saw it. A small pile of rocks stacked near the base of a tree, arranged carefully in a way that looked deliberate. Under the pile was a rough carving on the tree trunk. It was hard to make out in the fading light, but it looked like a symbol, two circles connected by a line. It wasn't something I recognized, but it felt like a warning or a marker. I shivered and took a picture with my phone. My hands trembled as I turned back toward the cabin. I loaded up the car and started the engine. As I pulled away from the gravel road, I looked back once more. The cabin sat quiet in the darkening woods, the windows like empty eyes staring into the trees. Driving down the winding road, I kept replaying the last few days in my mind. The noises, the footprints, the strange symbol. It all added up to one thing. Someone had been watching the cabin. Not a ghost or some mythical creature, but a person. Someone who didn't want visitors. Later, at home, I contacted the rental company and asked about the cabin. They told me it had belonged to a private owner who rarely visited, but there had been rumors about people living or hiding in the woods nearby. Hunters, squatters, or worse. The area was known for occasional illegal activity because of how remote it was. That explained the footprints, the noises, and the strange symbol. A warning from someone protecting their territory. I didn't go back, but the experience stayed with me. A reminder that isolation can hide dangers that don't need magic or monsters. Just people, shadows, and the quiet, watching woods. The forest had always been a place I felt drawn to, a kind of quiet refuge from the noise and rush of city life. The cabin I had rented was tucked deep into a remote part of the woods, far from any town or road. It wasn't fancy, just an old wooden structure with peeling paint and a creaky porch. But that was exactly why I chose it. I wanted solitude and a chance to clear my mind, away from everything familiar. I arrived just as the sun was dipping low, the last rays of daylight filtering through the thick branches overhead. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was quiet in a way that felt almost too complete. No cars, no voices, just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird settling in for the night. I carried my bags up the narrow steps to the porch, my boots thudding softly on the worn wood. The cabin's front door was unlocked, the kind of trust that comes with being so far off the beaten path. Inside, the place was dim but clean. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the smell of aged wood mixed with faint traces of smoke from an old fireplace. I switched on the small lamp by the table, revealing a modest living room with a threadbare couch and a bookshelf filled with dog-eared paperbacks and old magazines. The kitchen was tiny but functional, with a small stove, a rusty sink, and a few chipped dishes stacked on a shelf. I unpacked my things slowly, letting the quiet seep in. Outside, the forest was growing darker by the minute, the sky turning a deep shade of blue before finally fading to black. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames casting warm shadows across the room. Sitting there, the heat against my face, I felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease. The woods beyond the windows seemed to press close, the trees like silent watchers. That night, I slept with the windows slightly open, the cool air drifting in. Around midnight, I woke to a faint noise, something scraping, almost like nails against wood. My heart jumped. I lay still, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe it was an animal or the wind shifting branches. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, and soon I drifted back to sleep. The next day was bright and clear. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves, the trees tall and thick. I followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the forest, stepping over roots and rocks. Birds called above me, and now and then a squirrel darted between the trees. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and earth, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden beams. After a while, I came to a small stream, the water clear and cold. I knelt down and cupped my hands to drink, the chill refreshing. Nearby, I found old footprints in the mud, human, but not fresh. They led away from the path, toward a dense thicket. I felt a prick of unease, but decided to turn back. The last thing I wanted was to wander too far off the beaten path. Back at the cabin, I made a simple lunch from canned soup and bread. The fire was still warm in the hearth, and I spent the afternoon reading, the words blurring as my mind wandered. The quietness pressed on me again, thick and heavy. I kept the windows closed this time, the feeling of being watched creeping in. It was irrational, but I couldn't shake it. As evening fell, I prepared for the night. The sun sank behind the trees, and shadows lengthened. I sat near the fireplace, the flames dancing and casting flickering light across the walls. The silence was deep, but then it was broken, soft thuds from outside, near the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. My pulse quickened. The noise wasn't like the forest sounds I had heard during the day. It was heavier, deliberate. I stood and peered out the window. The night was black, and the trees were silhouettes against the sky. I could make out nothing moving. The thuds came again, 1, 2, 3, slow and steady. My breath caught. It sounded like footsteps, heavy boots on the soft ground. I wanted to believe it was another hiker or maybe a ranger, but no vehicles were nearby, and I hadn't heard a car all day. The footsteps stopped just beyond the clearing. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then came another sound, a faint scraping, like someone dragging something over the dirt. I reached for the old hunting rifle the cabin owner had left behind for emergencies. Felt heavy in my hands, cold and foreign. I stayed near the window, eyes fixed on the dark forest. Minutes passed. The noises faded, replaced again by the natural sounds of the night. I tried to settle down, telling myself it was likely an animal, a deer or a bear moving through the underbrush. But the footsteps were too heavy, and the scraping too deliberate. The next morning, I found marks outside on the ground near the porch. Deep scratches in the dirt and bark stripped from a nearby tree. There were no footprints, only these signs of something large moving close to the cabin. The thought unsettled me deeply. I packed a small bag, intending to leave. The idea of staying another night made my skin crawl. But before I could head out, I noticed the car parked by the dirt road at the edge of the property was gone. That was strange. It was my only way back. The nearest town was miles away, and my phone had no signal. I checked the cabin carefully, doors and windows all locked. The forest was still, but every shadow seemed to shift and lengthen when I looked away. I decided to hike the trail back to the main road on foot. I left the cabin, my heart hammering with every step into the woods. The forest felt alive with quiet menace. Every crack of a twig and rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept walking fast, glancing over my shoulder as if something might be following me. After what felt like hours, I reached the main dirt road. It was empty, deserted, no cars or people in sight. I started walking toward the nearest town, hoping to find help. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods were silent, but the memory of those footsteps and the scraping noise haunted me. I realized then that someone had been nearby the cabin the whole time, someone who didn't want me there. Eventually, I found a farmhouse where the owners gave me a ride to the town and called the local sheriff. When I returned with them, the cabin was empty, no sign of who had been there or what they wanted. I left the forest behind, shaken but alive, with a new respect for how close danger can be, even in places that feel safest. From that day on, I never went back to the cabin. The quiet woods held a secret, and I was glad to be far away from it. The late afternoon sun was just starting to slip behind the trees when I pulled my car up to the small dirt road that led to the cabin. It had been a long drive from the city, the kind of drive that stretches out your muscles and frays your patience, but somehow I had looked forward to this moment for weeks. The promise of quiet, the chance to be alone in the woods, away from noise and people, had pulled me here. I parked near the edge of a clearing, the gravel crunching under my tires, and stepped out. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, that fresh scent you only get in places where the forest still rules. The cabin stood at the far end of the clearing, small and weathered, but sturdy. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with a porch that wrapped around two sides. The paint had chipped off in places, revealing bare wood that had darkened with age. A thin column of smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney, a sign that someone had been here recently, but I saw no other signs of life. The place was silent except for the soft rustling of the wind through the branches and the occasional call of a distant bird. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and started toward the cabin. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the air cooled as the sun dropped lower. When I reached the porch, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. That startled me. I had expected it to be locked since the last owner had said the place would be ready when I arrived. Still, I didn't feel a sudden fear, only a sense of alertness. Maybe whoever had been here left in a hurry or forgot to close the door properly. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and a faint hint of mildew. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the windows were grimy, letting in soft, fading light. It was sparsely furnished. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner covered with a thick quilt, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. A stack of firewood sat near the stove, neatly arranged. On the table, I spotted a few old newspapers and a half-empty jar of coffee grounds. No sign of anyone currently inside. I set my bags down and walked to the window. Outside, the forest stood dense and still, the trees tall and dark against the orange-pink sky. I felt a quiet thrill, the kind of thrill that comes when you know you're truly alone somewhere wild. I took a deep breath and let the calm soak into me. After the noise of the city, this felt like a different world. I spent the next hour unpacking, setting my things down carefully. The cabin was cold, so I stacked some firewood in the stove and lit a small fire. The flames flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls. I made myself a simple meal, canned beans and bread, eating slowly, enjoying the silence broken only by the crackling fire. When darkness settled fully, I stepped outside onto the porch. The sky was a deep navy blue, stars sparkling like scattered diamonds. The forest was black beyond the clearing, and the only sounds were the night insects buzzing softly and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere far off. I stood there for a long time, feeling small and peaceful under the vast sky. Later, I went back inside and pulled out a blanket, spreading it over the bed. I felt a tired ache in my bones from the drive and the fresh air. The fire was still warm, and the room glowed gently. I lay down, eyes closing slowly. Sleep came easily, deep and heavy. When I woke, the light was pale and gray, filtered through the thick curtains. The cabin was quiet except for the soft tapping of rain against the window panes. I sat up and stretched, feeling the cool dampness in the air. Outside, the sky was overcast, and the trees glistened with moisture. I wrapped a sweater around me and made my way to the kitchen corner, boiling water on the stove for coffee. The rain fell steadily all morning, drumming on the roof in a steady rhythm. I stayed inside, reading an old paperback I'd brought, watching the drops slide down the windows. The forest seemed to hold its breath under the steady gray sky. There was no one around, just me and the quiet company of the woods. By midday, the rain eased to a mist, and I decided to take a walk despite the damp. I pulled on my boots and a rain jacket, stepping out into the moist, earthy smell of the forest. The ground was muddy, and my footsteps left prints in the soft dirt. The trees towered over me, trunks thick with moss and lichen. Branches dripped with rainwater. I followed a narrow path I'd seen from the cabin, winding through the undergrowth. The forest felt alive in a different way than the day before. Quieter, denser, more intimate. I spotted small tracks in the mud, likely made by deer or raccoons. Occasionally, a squirrel dashed up a tree, startled by my presence. The mist hung low, weaving through the trunks like smoke. After a while, I reached a small creek. The water ran clear and cold, tumbling over stones and roots. I knelt to cup the water in my hands and felt its chill. The sound of the creek was peaceful, a constant gentle rush. I stayed there for some time, listening, watching the water move. On the way back, the sky began to clear, the sun breaking through in slanting beams. The forest lightened, leaves shimmering wet and bright. When I reached the cabin, the air smelled fresh and clean. That night, I made a bigger fire in the stove, the warmth filling the small room. Outside, The stars were out again, cold and sharp. I sat by the fire with a notebook, jotting down thoughts and impressions from the day. The solitude was a strange kind of comfort, a reminder of how small I was in the larger world. But as the night deepened, a feeling settled over me, not fear exactly, but unease. The kind that comes when you realize how quiet the world really is, and how alone you truly are. The forest around the cabin was so close, the dark pressing up against the windows. Every small sound seemed louder. A branch tapping, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. I shook off the feeling and went to bed early, pulling the blanket tight around me. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cool but not cold. On the third day, I woke before dawn to a strange noise. It was faint, almost lost in the sound of wind and leaves, but it was there. A scraping, like something dragging along the ground outside. I sat up, heart beating faster, listening carefully. The noise stopped as suddenly as it started. I got up and looked out the window but saw nothing except the shifting shadows of trees. The sun was just starting to rise, turning the sky pale pink. I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal, a deer moving through the brush or a raccoon searching for food, but the sound had been too deliberate, too heavy. Still, no signs of anything unusual outside. The day passed slowly. I spent it cleaning the cabin, sweeping the floor, wiping down surfaces. I checked the perimeter of the clearing, making sure everything was as it should be. Nothing seemed out of place. That night, I tried to sleep but kept waking at odd moments, hearing noises outside, branches breaking, leaves rustling. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, soft and cautious. I stayed still, listening, eyes wide in the dark. On the fourth day, I decided to explore further into the forest. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and a map I had printed from a hiking site. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear blue. I followed an old logging trail that disappeared deep into the trees, the path uneven and covered with roots and stones. The forest was thick, trees standing close together with moss hanging from branches. The ground was soft with fallen needles and leaves. I walked for hours, passing patches of wildflowers and small clearings where sunlight streamed down. I felt alive and free, the quiet broken only by the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird. The trail curved and climbed slightly, leading to a rocky ridge that overlooked a wide valley below. I sat on a boulder and drank water, taking in the view, layers of forest stretching out to the horizon, a river winding through the trees. After a long rest, I headed back, the sun lower in the sky. As I walked, I noticed something odd: fresh footprints in the mud, larger than mine, heading the same way I was. The prints looked recent, the edges still soft. I paused, heart quickening. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. The footprints stopped near the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. My stomach tightened. Back at the cabin, I searched around the outside, looking for signs of anyone nearby. Nothing obvious, but I found a small pile of stones near the porch steps. Stones that hadn't been there when I arrived. I brought them inside and placed them on the table, feeling unsettled. That night, I stayed awake until the fire died down, watching the shadows flicker. The silence was heavy, pressing in. On the fifth day, the unease grew. I heard more noises, the scrape of something outside, the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. I found small marks on the wooden walls, scratches that looked deliberate. I checked the cabin was not far from the main road, but far enough that the trees blocked most of the light. I'd never been to that part of the forest before, which was one reason I chose it. It was late October, and the sun had already started to set by the time I pulled the old truck into the narrow dirt driveway. The gravel crunched sharply under the tires, a noise that seemed to echo oddly in the quiet air. The trees were tall and thick, mostly pines and maples, their branches bare and jagged in the fading light. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that looked like they might break open soon. I could smell the damp earth and fallen leaves, mixed with the faint scent of pine resin. The cabin itself was small, made of rough timber logs that looked aged but sturdy. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dusty, with dark curtains drawn tight inside. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped out, and I could hear the wind whispering through the branches above. There was no electricity, no phone signal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. This was exactly what I wanted. A place to be alone, away from the noise and crowds. I pulled my backpack from the truck bed, carrying it up the steps and inside. The door was heavy but unlocked, and it swung open with a groan. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and faint smoke, like it had been sitting and used for a while. There was a small stove in the corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a bed covered in a thick wool blanket. A few cans of beans and a bottle of water sat on the shelf. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the windows looked out onto the dense forest all around. I set down my bag and lit the oil lamp hanging on the wall. The flickering light made the shadows dance, and for a moment, the silence felt thick, almost heavy. I unpacked some food and a thermos of coffee, then sat down at the table to eat. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the branches against the cabin walls. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush. As darkness fell, I built a fire in the stove, the heat slowly filling the small room. The flames crackled and popped, casting warm light that made the cabin feel less empty. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and settled into the creaky old chair by the fire. I could hear the occasional owl hoot in the distance, and the wind continued to whistle through the trees. There was no other sound, just the deep quiet of the forest at night. Around midnight, the fire had died down to glowing embers, and I was starting to feel the weight of sleep pressing on me. The cabin felt colder now, the wooden walls seeming to absorb the chill from outside. As I stood to put more wood on the fire, I heard it. A faint noise from outside, something like footsteps crunching through the dead leaves. I froze, listening closely. The wind was still blowing, but those footsteps were slow, deliberate, and just beyond the window. I didn't move for a moment, hoping it was just my imagination. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thicker than before. I thought about stepping outside to look, but the darkness and the thought of whoever might be out there held me back. I closed the curtains tightly, locked the door, and sat back down by the fire. I told myself it was probably an animal or someone else passing by on a late walk, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled deep in my chest. The night dragged on, and the footsteps never came again, but every little sound, the creak of the wood, the rustle of the wind, seemed amplified in the dark cabin. When morning finally came, the first rays of sun filtered through the thin curtains, softening the shadows. I opened the door to look around the porch and the edge of the forest. There were no footprints in the dirt or leaf litter, no signs anyone had been near. I stayed the day mostly inside, chopping firewood and cleaning the cabin. The isolation was strange but peaceful. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call or the scurry of squirrels in the underbrush. I took long walks along the nearby creek, the cold water rushing over smooth stones. The forest was beautiful in its late autumn decay. Branches stripped bare, the ground blanketed in crunchy brown leaves, and the air sharp with cold. That night, the wind was fiercer, rattling the windows and howling around the cabin. I built a bigger fire and wrapped myself tightly in the blanket. Again, just as I was drifting to sleep, I heard the footsteps outside. They were clearer this time, slow, deliberate, approaching the cabin's edge. My heart pounded as I sat frozen, trying to listen past the howl of the wind. Then something different, a low, soft tapping on the wooden wall near the window. 3 quick taps, then silence. I held my breath, the hair on my arms standing straight. After a long moment, the tapping came again, 3 taps. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. Then the wind drowned out any other sound. Morning came like a relief, gray and cold. I forced myself to go outside, scanning the trees and ground for any sign of whoever or whatever had been there. There was nothing but the usual forest debris. No footprints, no marks on the cabin wall, no sign of anyone. I packed my things that day, my fingers stiff from the cold and nerves. The peacefulness of the forest had turned into something else, something tense and watchful. As I loaded the truck, I noticed faint scratch marks on the cabin's wooden siding near the window where the tapping had come. Thin, shallow, but definitely human-made. The drive out was slow, my eyes darting to the forest edges with every bend in the road. The sky was still overcast, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. I kept the truck windows closed and the doors locked. When I finally reached the highway and the familiar hum of cars and people, relief washed over me. Back home, I called the local ranger station and reported the marks and noises. They told me the area was known for hikers and hunters, some less than friendly. It wasn't unusual for people to camp illegally or wander into private cabins. They promised to check it out. Weeks later, I heard on the news about a man who had been caught trespassing in a remote cabin not far from the one I had stayed in. He was arrested for breaking and entering, and it turned out he had been living rough in the woods, stealing food and supplies from cabins. The tapping on the wall was his way of trying to get attention or scare off anyone inside. The fear I felt that night was real, but it wasn't something supernatural or unexplained. It was just a man trying to survive in the woods, desperate and dangerous. I learned to respect the forest more, not just for its beauty, but for the unpredictability of the people who live there too. I don't go back to that cabin. I stick to campgrounds now where there are other people, lights, and the safety of being seen. The quiet in the forest is no longer comforting. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but real people with real problems, and the risk that comes with being alone and vulnerable in the wild. That trip changed the way I look at solitude. Being alone isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's dangerous, and sometimes the forest holds secrets not of spirits, but of people trying to survive, and that can be terrifying in its own way. The woods felt different the moment I stepped off the narrow dirt road and onto the small path leading to the cabin. The trees here were thicker, older, their trunks wide and knotted with age. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and the silence was deeper than I expected. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals, just the soft crunch of my boots on the forest floor. I pulled my jacket tighter, though it wasn't cold, just that uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I had found this cabin listed online, an old rental tucked away in a remote part of the mountains, the kind of place you'd imagine as a perfect getaway, far from the noise of the city, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away. I needed that kind of silence, a break from the endless hum of my everyday life. My phone lost signal halfway through the drive, and that was a relief. No calls, no messages, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and this old cabin. The cabin was small, built from rough-hewn logs that had darkened over the years. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the paint on the window frames was chipped and faded. It looked like it hadn't been cared for much recently, but that was fine. I didn't want a shiny new place. I wanted something real, something untouched by the endless rush of modern life. I unlocked the creaky door and stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the slanting beams of late afternoon sunlight. The air smelled faintly of mold and wood smoke, probably from the last time someone used the old cast iron stove in the corner. The furniture was sparse. A rickety wooden table, a couple of chairs, a worn-out couch with threadbare cushions, and a small bookshelf lined with dog-eared paperbacks and a few magazines yellowed with age. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, dangling by a cord. The windows were dirty, smudged with grime, but the glass was intact. I set my pack down and pulled open the windows, letting the fresh forest air flood the room. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the clearing. I made a quick sweep of the place to find firewood, and to my relief, there was a decent stack piled near the back door. I chopped some kindling with the small axe I brought and lit a fire in the stove. The room quickly warmed, and the flickering flames painted the walls with dancing shadows. That first night, sleep came slowly. The quiet was absolute and strange. At home, there was always some background noise. The hum of traffic, distant voices, the occasional dog barking. But here, the silence pressed down on me. Every creak of the cabin settling, every faint snap of a twig outside made me jump slightly. I lay awake for hours, listening. There was something else out there, I was sure of it. Not animals, at least not the usual kind. It felt heavier, like the forest itself was watching. Morning brought some relief. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and the familiar sounds of birds and squirrels returned. I stepped outside to find the forest alive again, but still thick and dense, the kind of place where you could easily lose your way. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and firs. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles, and small patches of wildflowers added spots of color here and there. I spent the day exploring the area. There was a narrow creek not far from the cabin, the water cold and clear. I followed it upstream for a while, slipping on wet rocks and brushing past brambles. The farther I went, the more I noticed subtle signs that someone else had been here recently. A discarded soda can crushed underfoot, footprints half covered in mud, and the occasional piece of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush. But there was no one in sight. Back at the cabin, I started to settle in. I cleaned a bit, stacked firewood, and prepared a simple meal on the stove. The isolation was peaceful, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was in the middle of nowhere, and that kind of tension was natural. The second night was worse. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the cabin groan. Outside, branches scraped against the walls, and there were strange noises, soft thuds, the crunch of leaves, the occasional distant snap of wood. I stayed close to the fire, poking the embers to keep it alive. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement just beyond the treeline, but whenever I looked directly, there was nothing. Around midnight, I heard something near the back door. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel. I froze, heart pounding. The door didn't move. No knock, no rattling, just footsteps stopping abruptly and then retreating into the dark. I waited, breath held, but the night swallowed the sound. The next day, I checked outside. The gravel was disturbed, footprints clear in the soft dirt near the back door. They were large, rough prints, deeper than mine, heading into the forest and back again. I felt a chill despite the warm sun. Someone had been watching me. For the rest of the day, I kept my axe close and stayed near the cabin. I didn't venture far. The forest felt less friendly now, like a maze built to trap me inside. At night, I kept the fire burning longer, stacking wood just in case. The footsteps came again, always slow, always just outside the cabin, never close enough to see a person. On the third morning, I found something new. A circle of small stones arranged carefully on the porch. No note, no sign, just the stones placed neatly like a crude boundary or a warning. I didn't touch them. I knew whoever had done this wanted me to see it. I packed my bag quietly that afternoon, ready to leave. I needed to get out before this feeling turned to fear that I couldn't shake. As I grabbed my pack from the floor, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it last night. My heart jumped. I stepped outside slowly. No one in sight. The stone circle was still there. The gravel near the door was freshly disturbed, deeper prints pressed into the soft earth. I debated calling the police, but with no phone signal, that wasn't possible. I decided to hike back to the road, keeping my axe in hand. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the shadows growing longer as the sun slipped behind the hills. I moved quickly but carefully, listening for the footsteps or any other sounds that might follow me. For the first time, I felt like I was not alone in these woods. Not just some random person passing through, but someone watching, waiting. After an hour of walking, I finally heard the faint hum of a distant car engine. Relief flooded me. I broke into a run, branches scraping my arms, but I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road. When I got to the main road, I found a passing car and flagged it down. I told the driver about the cabin, the footsteps, and the stones. He listened quietly and nodded. "Some people come out here looking for something," he said. "Not sure what, but they don't like visitors. It's not a place to mess with." He gave me a ride to the nearest town where I could use a phone. I called the local sheriff and reported what I found. They said they would check the area, but with no concrete proof, there wasn't much they could do. That was the last time I went back to that cabin. I never found out who was leaving those footprints or what the stone circle meant, but I didn't want to stay and find out. Sometimes, I still think about those woods, the silence, the eyes that seemed to watch from the dark. The cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts or monsters. It was something more real and more dangerous. The knowledge that there are places where you don't belong, and others who make sure you understand that without a word spoken. I learned that some kinds of fear don't need ghosts. Sometimes just being watched in the right way is enough to make you leave and never look back. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest, worn and quiet. It was a small place, built with rough timber and old nails, its roof sagging slightly in the middle where the years had taken their toll. I had found it on a map while looking for a weekend escape from the city. The place was miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods where the trees grew thick and the dirt road ended. I wanted silence, to be away from everything. No phones, no traffic, just the crackle of fire and the wind through the leaves. I arrived just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The air was cool and sharp, the kind of cold that seeps through layers of clothes and sticks to your skin. The cabin smelled of pine and damp wood. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I stepped inside, the windows dusty but clear enough to see the fading light outside. I set my bag down on the old kitchen table, its surface scarred and stained from years of use. There was a wood stove in the corner, cold and empty, and a few mismatched chairs pushed under the table. The furniture was sparse but sturdy, made for function rather than comfort. I had packed enough food to last me the weekend: canned beans, some bread, a little cheese and apples. I also brought a small axe and some firewood I found stacked near the back door. The cabin had no electricity or running water, so I knew I'd have to fetch water from the nearby stream and keep a fire going to stay warm. The idea of this kind of isolation was thrilling. No distractions, no obligations, just me and the woods. After I unpacked, I headed outside to explore a little before nightfall. The forest was thick, old trees standing tall like sentinels. The ground was covered with pine needles and fallen leaves, soft underfoot but uneven, with roots and rocks hidden beneath. The air smelled of earth and moss, a clean smell that made you feel like you were somewhere untouched. I walked down a narrow trail, careful not to stray too far. The stream was just a few minutes away, a narrow ribbon of clear water running over smooth stones. I filled my bottle there, the water cool and fresh. The sun dropped lower, turning the sky a deep orange that faded into purple. I hurried back to the cabin to start a fire before it got too dark. I stacked the wood in the stove, struck a match, and the flames caught quickly, crackling and spitting as they warmed the room. The light flickered on the wooden walls, casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the flames. I sat back in one of the chairs, my body relaxing after the walk. As night fell, the forest outside grew quiet. The sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. The dark pressed close around the cabin, and I could hear the wind sighing through the trees. I found an old blanket in the corner, rough but warm, and curled up near the fire. The fire's warmth and light kept the cold at bay and made the cabin feel less lonely. Hours passed, and the night deepened. I lay there, listening to the forest breathe, feeling the slow pulse of the earth. I thought about the city, the noise, the rush, the endless screens. Out here, none of that mattered. It was just the raw world, alive and breathing, simple and clear. But then, I heard something that made me sit up, a sound that didn't belong. A faint tapping, like someone knocking on the door. It was soft and slow, irregular. My heart sped up, a rush of adrenaline flooding my chest. I stared at the door, waiting, but there was nothing. No shadow, no movement. I told myself it was probably a branch tapping against the wood, or a bird. The wind had picked up again, shifting the trees and making strange noises. I forced myself to calm down, reminding myself I was alone out here by choice. The woods were full of animals, and some sounds were just natural. But the knocking came again, this time a little louder, more deliberate. I stood up and walked slowly to the door, my hand hesitating on the rough wood before I pulled it open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no one there, just the darkness and the forest. I stepped outside, the ground cold and soft beneath my boots. I looked around, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved except the branches swaying in the wind. The knocking stopped. I closed the door and bolted it tightly, feeling the weight of the lock more than before. Back inside, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I sat back down, stoked the fire, and wrapped myself tighter in the blanket. But the tapping came again, now from the window. It was lighter this time, like a finger tapping on glass. I didn't want to look, didn't want to know what might be there. I told myself it was just a trick of the wind or a branch brushing against the pane. But the sound was so clear it was impossible to ignore. I got up again and pulled back the curtain. Outside was just the night, the black shapes of trees, the silver light of the moon, and nothing else. No eyes, no faces, no footsteps in the dirt. I stood there for a moment, breath clouding in the cold air, then closed the curtain and sat back down, trying to calm my racing heart. The rest of the night passed slowly. I kept the fire burning bright, listening closely to the sounds outside. The forest was alive, but nothing else came near the cabin. By dawn, I was exhausted, sleep broken and shallow. Morning brought light and calm. The sun filtered through the trees, warming the cabin and chasing away the shadows. I packed my bag, made a final check of the cabin, and stepped outside. The forest was peaceful again, the knocking and tapping just a memory now. I walked back to my car along the dirt road, the fresh air clearing my head. The cabin was just a place, old and weathered, surrounded by the vastness of the forest. The sounds I heard were part of that wildness, not anything more. The forest was full of life and noise, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, it felt like it was trying to remind me that I was a visitor there, small and temporary. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of relief and respect. The cabin had given me what I came for, a chance to step outside the world and face the raw reality of nature. It wasn't magic or mystery, just the real, living world, sometimes strange and unsettling, but always honest. I promised myself I'd come back someday, better prepared, with more knowledge of the land and its sounds. The cabin wasn't scary, it was a challenge, and I'd met that challenge, learned from it, and come away stronger. That weekend in the woods was a reminder that even in silence, life goes on, and even in fear, there's a clear path forward.